In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a chilling prophecy of blue geraniums foretells death for Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, a frail widow haunted by fear. When she's found dead, clutching the cursed flowers, the village cries curse. But Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp mind and gentle smile, sees murder. Unravelling a web of greed, betrayal and poison, Marple exposes a killer hiding behind superstition, proving that in Rose Cottage, the deadliest secrets bloom in plain sight. Dive into the blue geranium, where every petal hides a clue. Chapter 1. The Fortune Teller's Warning. The autumn wind swept through St. Mary Mead with a restless edge, tugging at the last of the chrysanthemums in Miss Jane Marple's garden. From her chintz-curtained window, she watched the leaves skitter across the lawn, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm. The village, usually a haven of predictable routines, hummed with an undercurrent of unease, and Miss Marple, with her keen ear for gossip, had caught its source. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, the wealthy widow of Rose Cottage, had fallen under the spell of a fortune-teller named Madame Zelma, whose velvet-draped tent had appeared on the common a fortnight ago. The news came via Clara, Miss Marple's young maid, who bustled in with a tray of tea and a tale fresh from the grocer's boy. "It's all anyone talks about, miss," Clara said, setting down the teapot with a clink. Madame Zelma looked into her crystal ball and told Mrs. Pritchard to beware of blue flowers. "Geraniums," she said they'd bring death before the winter's out. Clara's eyes were wide, but Miss Marple's remained steady, her needles pausing only briefly. "Superstition is a dangerous thing, Clara," she remarked, her voice mild but her mind alert. "It's like a seed. Once planted, it grows in the most unexpected ways." She sipped her tea, considering. Mrs. Pritchard was known for her nervous disposition, a woman prone to fancies and fears. A prophecy like this could unsettle her deeply, and Miss Marple, with her quiet habit of observing human nature, knew that fear could be manipulated. She resolved to visit Rose Cottage, ostensibly to deliver a jar of her homemade damson jam, but in truth to see for herself the state of affairs. The walk to Rose Cottage was brisk, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth. St. Mary Mead's High Street was its usual tableau of village life. The baker's boy whistling as he pushed, his cart, Mrs. Bantry gossiping with the postmistress, and old Mr. Tuttle tending his roses with arthritic care. Miss Marple nodded to each in turn, her fluffy shawl drawn about her shoulders, her eyes missing nothing. By the time she reached the wrought-iron gates of Rose Cottage, she had already pieced together fragments of the village's chatter. Mrs. Pritchard had not been seen at church since the fortune-teller's visit, and her household was said to be on edge. Rose Cottage stood at the end of a gravel path, its Georgian facade softened by climbing ivy. The garden, once Mrs. Pritchard's pride, looked oddly bare, its flower beds stripped of their usual colour. Miss Marple noted the absence of geraniums, blue or otherwise, and her lips pursed slightly. She rang the bell, and the door was opened by Susan, Mrs. Pritchard's companion, a slight girl with a pale face and eyes that darted like a startled deer's. "Oh, Miss Marple," Susan said, her voice catching. "How kind of you to call. Mrs. Pritchard is in the drawing-room, but she's not herself." Miss Marple smiled reassuringly, handing over the jar of jam. "Just a small gift, my dear. I thought I'd see how Mrs. Pritchard is faring." The Ethiopia village is full of talk, you know." Susan led her through the hall, where a grandfather clock ticked solemnly. The drawing-room was dim, its heavy curtains half drawn against the October light. Mrs. Pritchard sat by the fire, a shawl clutched about her thin shoulders, her face ashen. Nurse Copling, a stout woman with a starched cap and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, stood nearby, arranging a tray of medicine bottles. The air held a faint antiseptic tang, and Miss Marple's nose twitched. "Miss Marple, how good of you," Mrs. Pritchard said, her voice tremulous. "You've heard, I suppose, about the geraniums." Her hands twisted the shawl, and her eyes, wide with fear, fixed on her visitor. "I've heard something of it," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with the ease of one accustomed to putting others at ease. "A fortune-teller, I believe. Do tell me, Mrs. Pritchard." The story poured out in a rush. Madame Zelma, with her dark eyes and jangling bracelets, had gazed into her crystal ball and seen a vision of blue geraniums, their petals vivid against a shadowed backdrop. "She said they were a warning," Mrs. Pritchard whispered. "A sign of death coming soon. I can't sleep, Miss Marple. I see them in my dreams, those dreadful flowers." Nurse Copling clicked her tongue. "Nonsense, if you ask me," she said, her tone brisk. "Paying good money for such twaddle. You need rest, Mrs. Pritchard, not fairy tales." But her words were sharp, and Susan, hovering by the door, flinched as if struck. Miss Marple listened, her face a mask of gentle concern, but her mind was busy. She noted the nurse's proprietary air, the way her hands moved with practised efficiency among the bottles. She observed Susan's nervous glances, as if she feared speaking out of turn, and she saw Mrs. Pritchard's trembling fingers, clutching a handkerchief embroidered with her initials. Fear, Miss Marple knew, could be a tool, and someone in this house might be wielding it. As she rose to leave, promising to call again, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a vase in the corner, empty but for a single wilted stem. "Your flowers, Mrs. Pritchard," she said lightly. "Have you changed your garden this year?" Mrs. Pritchard shuddered. "I had them all dug up," she said. "Every geranium. I couldn't bear to look at them." Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene, but as she stepped into the crisp air of the garden, her thoughts were far from serene. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. "Blue geraniums," she murmured to herself. "A curious choice for a prophecy." She thought of her old friend Sir Henry Clithering, who had once spoken of crimes dressed in superstition. "People believe what they're told to believe," he'd said. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. She would watch, and she would listen, for in St. Mary Mead the truth was never far from the surface. Chapter 2. The Household at Rose Cottage. The late October sun cast a feeble glow over St. Mary Mead, its light barely penetrating the mist that clung to the hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat firmly pinned and her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, made her way to Rose Cottage for the second time that week. The jar of damson jam had been a pretext. Today, she carried a small posy of late-blooming asters, ostensibly to cheer Mrs. Pritchard, but in truth to grant her further entree into the troubled household. The fortune-teller's warning about blue geraniums, now the talk of the village, had stirred Miss Marple's curiosity, and her gentle demeanour belied the sharpness of her purpose. Rose Cottage loomed ahead, its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys exuding an air of faded elegance. The garden, once a riot of colour, now bore the scars of Mrs. Pritchard's fear. Bare patches of earth marked where geraniums had been uprooted, and the rose bushes, unpruned, straggled forlornly. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her eyes sweeping the scene. A gardener, a stooped man with a weathered face, was raking leaves into a pile, his movements slow and deliberate. She nodded to him, receiving a curt tip of his cap in return, and made a mental note to inquire about him later. Servants, she knew, often saw more than they said. The front door was opened by Susan Blake, Mrs. Pritchard's companion, whose pale cheeks and nervous hands betrayed her unease. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice a breathy whisper, "you're so kind to come again. Mrs. Pritchard is in the morning room. She's been asking for company." Susan's eyes darted toward the hall, as if expecting someone to emerge, and Miss Marple, with her knack for reading such signs, sensed a household under strain. The morning room was a pleasant space, its tall windows overlooking the lawn, though the curtains were drawn against the meagre sunlight. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard sat in a high-backed chair, a woolen blanket draped over her knees despite the fire crackling in the grate. Her face, once handsome, was now gaunt, her eyes shadowed with a fear that seemed to have taken root. Beside her stood Nurse Copling, a woman of middle years, whose starched uniform and tightly pinned hair gave her an air of unyielding authority. Her smile as she greeted Miss Marple was a thin line, efficient but devoid of warmth. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful," Mrs. Pritchard said, her voice quavering as she accepted the asters. "You've heard, of course, about the geraniums?" Her fingers plucked at the blanket, and her gaze flickered to Nurse Copling, as if seeking permission to speak. "I've heard the village talk," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair with the ease of one accustomed to putting others at their ease. A fortune-teller's words can be unsettling, but they're often more theatre than truth. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes, bright and inquisitive, missed nothing. The tremor in Mrs. Pritchard's hands, the faint flush on Susan's cheeks, and the way Nurse Copling's fingers tightened on the back of the chair. "It's not just talk," Mrs. Pritchard said, leaning forward. Madame Zelma saw it clearly. "Blue geraniums, a sign of death. I've had nightmares, Miss Marple, every night since. I see them, those flowers, glowing like poison in the dark." Her voice rose, and Nurse Copling stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Now, Mrs. Pritchard," the nurse said, her tone brisk. "You mustn't work yourself up. It's all nonsense, as I've said. You need rest and your tonic, not these fanciful stories." She turned to Miss Marple, her smile tightening. "The village is full of gossips, Miss Marple. It doesn't help her nerves." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic, but her mind was busy. She recalled her old friend Dr. Haydock's lectures on the power of suggestion, how a fearful mind could be led to see omens in the mundane. "A tonic, you say?" she asked, her voice light. "I've always found chamomile soothing for the nerves." Nurse Copling's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mrs. Pritchard's condition requires something stronger," she said. "I prepare her. Medicines myself under Dr. Sims's orders. She's been frail for months, heart trouble, you know." She gestured to a small table, where a tray held several vials and a glass of cloudy liquid. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the tray, noting the labels, though she could not read them from her seat. Susan, who had been hovering near the door, spoke up, her voice hesitant. "Mrs. Pritchard hasn't eaten much today. I thought perhaps some tea and biscuits." She glanced at Nurse Copling, who gave a curt nod, and Susan hurried out, her footsteps echoing in the hall. Miss Marple seized the moment to steer the conversation. "You've a fine house here, Mrs. Pritchard," she said. "It must take a good staff to keep it running smoothly. Your butler, for instance, George, isn't it? He seems most capable." Mrs. Pritchard brightened slightly. "Oh, George has been with us for years, ever since my husband was alive. He's loyal, though a bit distracted lately. I think the village talk upsets him." She sighed. "And then there's Susan, such a dear girl, but so timid. I don't know what I'd do without Nurse Copling, though. She's my rock." Nurse Copling inclined her head, but Miss Marple noted the faint smirk that crossed her lips. "It's my duty," the nurse said. "Mrs. Pritchard needs constant care. Her nephew, Mr. Hugh, visits when he can, but he's a busy young man." Miss Marple's ears pricked at the mention of Hugh Pritchard. She had heard of him. A charming but feckless young man, rumoured to be in debt and hopeful of his aunt's fortune. "A nephew is a blessing," she said mildly. "Does he stay often?" "Too often, if you ask me," Nurse Copling muttered, then caught herself. "That is, he comes and goes. He was here last week, full of his usual schemes. Mrs. Pritchard finds his visits tiring." Mrs. Pritchard's face clouded. "Hugh means well," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "He's just young. He'll settle down." The door opened, and Susan returned with a tea tray, followed by George, the butler, a tall man with greying hair and a preoccupied air. His hands, as he set down the tray, trembled slightly, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the faint stain of ink on his fingers. "Thank you, George," Mrs. Pritchard said, and he bowed, retreating silently. Tea was poured, and Miss Marple, accepting a cup, steered the conversation to lighter topics: village events, the upcoming fete, the new vicars, sermons. But her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the dynamics of the household. Susan's deference to Nurse Copling, the nurse's control over Mrs. Pritchard's care, George's distraction, and the shadow of Hugh's ambitions, all were threads in a tapestry she could not yet fully discern. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a photograph on the mantel. A younger Mrs. Pritchard with a man, presumably her late husband, standing in the garden. Behind them bloomed a profusion of geraniums, their blue petals vivid against the green. She set down her cup, her expression unchanged, but her thoughts quickened. "What a lovely photograph," she said. "Your garden was splendid then." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes filled with tears. "It was Charles's pride," she said. "He loved those geraniums. I can't bear to look at them now." She shuddered, and Nurse Copling handed her the glass of tonic, urging her to drink. Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Pritchard sipped the liquid, her face twisting slightly at the taste. "Bitter," she murmured, but she drained the glass under Nurse Copling's watchful eye. Susan, clearing the tea things, dropped a spoon, and the clatter seemed to startle her. Miss Marple, with her knack for noticing the small things, saw the girl's hands shake as she retrieved it. The visit drew to a close, and Miss Marple rose, promising to call again. "You must take care, Mrs. Pritchard." she said, her voice warm. "And don't let these fancies trouble you too much. The mind can play tricks, you know." Mrs. Pritchard managed a weak smile. "You're very kind, Miss Marple. I wish I could be as calm as you." Nurse Copling escorted Miss Marple to the door, her manner polite but guarded. "Mrs. Pritchard is lucky to have such attentive friends," she said, but her eyes were cold, and Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. As she walked back to her cottage, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of impressions. The household at Rose Cottage was a microcosm of tension, each member playing a role she could not yet define. Susan's timidity suggested fear, but of what or whom? George's distraction hinted at preoccupations beyond his duties, perhaps financial or personal. Nurse Copling's authority was absolute, her control over Mrs. Pritchard's medicines a point of particular interest, and Hugh, though absent, loomed large, his motives uncertain. Miss Marple paused at the village green, where children played under the watchful eyes of their mothers. She thought of her nephew Raymond, who wrote detective stories and often spoke of motives hidden in plain sight. "People are so predictable," he'd once said, "once you see their patterns." Miss Marple smiled faintly. She would watch the patterns at Rose Cottage, for in their weaving, she suspected, lay the truth. Back at her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting in her lap, though her needles remained still. Clara, bringing in the evening post, chattered about the latest village gossip. Madame Zelma had predicted rain for the fete, and Mrs. Bantry was in a tizzy. Miss Marple listened, nodding, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She recalled a case Sir Henry Clithering had once shared, of a poisoner who used superstition to mask their crime. The victim's fear was the perfect disguise, he'd said. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Fear," she murmured, "and flowers." She picked up her needles, the rhythm soothing, but her mind was far from calm. The household at Rose Cottage held secrets, and she would unravel them, thread by thread, before the prophecy of the blue geraniums claimed more than Mrs. Pritchard's peace. Chapter 3. A Pattern Emerges. The mist that had shrouded St. Mary Mead for days lifted on a crisp November morning, revealing a sky of pale blue that seemed to mock the village's undercurrent of disquiet. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl wrapped tightly against the chill, sat in her garden with a cup of tea, her knitting abandoned on the wicker table. Her eyes, sharp as ever, followed a robin hopping along the path, but her thoughts were fixed on Rose Cottage and the peculiar atmosphere she had sensed during her visits. The fortune-teller's warning about blue geraniums had taken root in Mrs. Pritchard's mind, and Miss Marple, with her quiet instinct for human nature, suspected that someone was tending that fear with care. The village was abuzz with speculation, and Miss Marple, adept at sifting truth from gossip, had spent the past few days gathering fragments of information. Her maid, Clara, was a willing conduit, relaying tales from the butcher's wife and the postman's daughter. Mrs. Pritchard, it seemed, had grown more reclusive, rarely leaving Rose Cottage except for brief visits to church, where she prayed with a fervour that unsettled the vicar. Her health, already fragile, had worsened, with complaints of nausea and dizziness that the village attributed to her obsession with Madame Zelma's prophecy. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, who bustled into the garden with an air of purpose. Jane, you must come to tea at the vicarage, she said, settling into a chair without waiting for an invitation. The village is positively feverish about Mrs. Pritchard. I thought you, of all people, might have a sensible view. Miss Marple smiled, her expression mild. I'm not sure I have much to offer, Griselda, but I'd be delighted to join you. Tell me, what's the latest talk? Mrs. Clement leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the relish of a good story. It's all about those wretched geraniums. Mrs. Pritchard is convinced they're cursed. She's had every blue flower in her garden destroyed, and now she won't even touch a bouquet unless it's been inspected. And her health. Oh, Jane, it's dreadful. She's been fainting, and her appetite is gone. Dr. Sims says it's her heart, but I wonder if it's all in her mind. Miss Marple's needles, which she had picked up absently, paused. The mind can be a powerful thing, she said. It can turn shadows into monsters, especially when someone whispers the right words. She thought of her nephew Raymond, whose tales of psychological manipulation had often struck her as uncomfortably close to village life. What does Nurse Copling say about it? Mrs. Clement sniffed. That woman! She's all efficiency and no heart. She says it's nerves and overexcitement, and she's got Mrs. Pritchard on some new medicine. But I don't like her, Jane. There's something cold about her. Miss Marple nodded, filing the observation away. And Susan, the companion? She seems a gentle soul. Oh, Susan's a mouse, Mrs. Clement said, waving a hand. She jumps at her own shadow, and I'm sure Nurse Copling bullies her. Poor girl, she's devoted to Mrs. Pritchard, but she hasn't the spine to stand up to anyone. The conversation turned to village matters, the fete, the new organist's shortcomings. But Miss Marple's mind lingered on Rose Cottage. Mrs. Pritchard's symptoms, as described, were troublingly vague, the kind that could be natural or induced. She recalled a conversation with Dr. Haydock years ago about poisons that worked slowly, mimicking illness until it was too late. The clever ones, he'd said, use what's already there. Fear, frailty, trust. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes distant. She would need to see Mrs. Pritchard again, and soon. That afternoon, she donned her best hat, a sensible black felt with a single feather, and set out for the vicarage. The walk took her past the common, where Madame Zelma's tent still stood, its garish purple flaps fluttering in the breeze. A small crowd lingered outside, mostly young girls giggling over palm readings. But Miss Marple noted a few older faces, drawn and anxious. Superstition, she thought, was a flame that spread quickly in a village like St. Mary Mead. The vicarage was a rambling house, its rooms cluttered with books and the detritus of parish life. Mrs. Clement, presiding over a silver teapot, had invited several village worthies, including Mrs. Bantry, whose forthright manner Miss Marple always enjoyed, and Miss Weatherby, a spinster with a nose for scandal. The talk inevitably turned to Mrs. Pritchard. "It's that fortune-teller," Miss Weatherby said, her voice sharp. "She's got half the village in a tizzy. I saw Mrs. Pritchard's butler, George, coming out of her tent yesterday. Imagine, a man his age falling for such nonsense." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "George? That's interesting. He struck me as a practical sort." Mrs. Bantry snorted. "Practical. He's been mooning about like a lost soul. My maid says he's in debt to the grocer, and he's been asking around for odd jobs. I wouldn't be surprised if he's after Madame Zelma's predictions for the horses." The room erupted in laughter, but Miss Marple's smile was thoughtful. Debt could make a man desperate, and desperation could lead to unwise actions. She turned to Mrs. Clement. "You mentioned Mrs. Pritchard's health. Has she seen Dr. Sims recently?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Clement said. "He was at Rose Cottage last week. He says it's her heart, aggravated by all this talk of geraniums. He's prescribed rest and whatever Nurse Copling's giving her. But Jane, she looks so frail. I saw her at church on Sunday, and she could barely stand through the hymns." Miss Marple's mind flashed to the tray of vials in the morning room. The cloudy tonic Mrs. Pritchard had drunk with such reluctance. "It's curious," she said, her voice soft, "how fear can amplify one's ailments. I wonder if there's more to it than nerves." Mrs. Bantry, catching the tone, leaned forward. "Jane Marple, you've got that look. What are you thinking? Is there something fishy at Rose Cottage?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I'm only an old woman with too much time to think, Dolly. But I do find patterns interesting. People, you know, are so much like my knitting. Pull one thread and the whole design shifts." The conversation moved on, but Miss Marple's thoughts remained with Mrs. Pritchard. She resolved to visit Rose Cottage the next day, perhaps under the guise of returning a borrowed recipe book. She needed to observe the household again, to see how the threads of fear, duty, and ambition were weaving together. The following morning, Miss Marple arrived at Rose Cottage just as the clock struck 11. Susan answered the door, her face paler than before, her hands twisting in her apron. "Miss Marple, thank goodness," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Mrs. Pritchard's in the conservatory, but she's had a bad night. She's talking about the geraniums again." The conservatory was a glass-walled room at the back of the house, filled with potted ferns and wicker furniture. Mrs. Pritchard sat in a cushioned chair, her eyes red-rimmed, a handkerchief clutched in her hand. Nurse Copling was absent, but George hovered nearby, adjusting a window shade with unnecessary care. Miss Marple noted his pallor, the way his eyes avoided hers, and the faint tremor in his hands. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Pritchard said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're so kind to come. I'm afraid I'm not good company today. Keep seeing them, those flowers. Last night I dreamed they were growing in my room, choking the air." Miss Marple sat beside her, patting her hand. "Dreams can be cruel, Mrs. Pritchard, but they're only dreams. Tell me, have you been feeling any better?" Mrs. Pritchard shook her head. "Worse, if anything. I'm so tired and my stomach, oh, it's dreadful. Nurse Copling says it's my nerves, but I wonder." Her voice trailed off, and she glanced at George, who had moved to water a fern, though the soil was already damp. Miss Marple followed her gaze. "George, you've been with Mrs. Pritchard a long time, haven't you?" she said, her tone conversational. "It must be hard seeing her so unwell." George started, nearly dropping the watering can. "Yes, miss," he said, his voice gruff. "It's not right, her being so poorly. She's always been good to me." He excused himself abruptly, muttering about duties in the pantry. Susan, who had been arranging cushions, spoke up hesitantly. "He's been worried, Miss Marple. He doesn't like Madame Zelma's talk. He says it's upsetting the house." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. George's agitation, Susan's fear, Mrs. Pritchard's symptoms, all were pieces of a puzzle she could not yet assemble. She turned to Mrs. Pritchard. "Have you tried anything new for your health?" A change of diet, perhaps. Nurse Copling manages all that, Mrs. Pritchard said. She's very particular about my meals. Says I need strengthening foods, soups mostly, and her tonics. They taste awful, but she insists. Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her thoughts were far from calm. She recalled a case Sir Henry Clithering had once described, of a nurse who had poisoned her patients under the guise of care, using their trust to mask her crimes. It's often the simplest things, he'd said, that hide the darkest deeds. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small table in the corner, where a tray held a bowl of soup, untouched, and a glass of the familiar cloudy tonic. The soup had a faint, acrid smell, not unlike the antiseptic tang she had noticed before. She made a mental note to ask Dr. Haydock about such odours, for her knowledge of chemistry was limited, but her instincts were not. Susan escorted her to the door, her voice low. "Miss Marple, I'm so worried. Mrs. Pritchard, she's not herself, and Nurse Copling, she watches everything. I don't know what to do." Miss Marple patted her arm. "You're doing your best, my dear. Just keep your eyes open and your wits about you. Sometimes the truth is right in front of us." As she walked home, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of possibilities. The household at Rose Cottage was a web of tensions, each member caught in their own struggles. George's debts, Susan's fear, Nurse Copling's control, and the absent Hugh's ambitions, all were threads she needed to untangle. She thought of her old friend Miss Hartnell, who had once fallen prey to a quack doctor's promises. "Trust," Miss Marple murmured, "is a dangerous gift." Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. Clara, bringing in a tray of scones, chattered about the latest village news. Madame Zelma had predicted a scandal at the fete, and the baker's wife was in a panic. Miss Marple listened, nodding, but her thoughts were with Mrs. Pritchard. A pattern was emerging, faint but unmistakable, and she would follow it, stitch by stitch, until the truth lay bare. Chapter 4. The First Incident. A sharp November wind rattled the windows of St. Mary Mead, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the promise of early frost. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlour with a shawl about her shoulders, was knitting, a scarf for the vicar's Christmas bazaar, but her needles moved slowly, her thoughts elsewhere. The village, usually a haven of predictable rhythms, was gripped by a fever of speculation, and at its heart was Rose Cottage, where Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard's fears had taken a darker turn. The fortune-teller, Madame Zelma's prophecy of blue, geraniums had woven itself into the fabric of village gossip, and Miss Marple, with her quiet knack for discerning truth, sensed that the threads of this mystery were tightening. The morning brought Clara, her maid, bursting through the door with news that sent Miss Marple's needles still. "Oh, miss, it's dreadful!" Clara exclaimed, her cap askew. "Mrs. Pritchard collapsed this morning, right after breakfast. They found a blue geranium petal on her tray, and she's in a terrible state. The whole village is talking, madam. Zelma's prophecy, they say." Clara's eyes were wide, but Miss Marple's remained calm, though her mind quickened. "A petal, you say?" Miss Marple asked, setting her knitting aside. "On her breakfast tray? That's curious. Who found it?" "Susan, miss," Clara replied, catching her breath. She was bringing in the tray, and there it was, plain as day. Mrs. Pritchard screamed and fainted dead away. Nurse Coupling had to revive her with smelling salts. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A geranium petal, appearing as if by magic, was no accident. She recalled her nephew Raymond's tales of staged clues designed to mislead or terrify. "Fear," she murmured, "is a powerful weapon." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "I think, Clara, I'll pay a visit to Rose Cottage. Mrs. Pritchard may need a friend, and I have a recipe for lemon drizzle cake I promised Susan." The walk to Rose Cottage was brisk, the village high street alive with whispers. At the baker's, Mrs. Weatherby was holding court, her voice carrying over the clink of coins. "It's a sign, mark my words," she declared. "Madame Zelma saw it coming, and now poor Mrs. Pritchard is at death's door." Miss Marple nodded politely, her fluffy hat bobbing, but her thoughts were on the petal. Geraniums did not bloom in November, and Rose Cottage's garden had been stripped of them weeks ago. Someone, she suspected, had placed that petal deliberately. Rose Cottage stood sombre under the grey sky, its windows reflecting the dull light. The bare flower beds, once vibrant, seemed to mock the prophecy, and Miss Marple paused to examine them, noting the freshly turned earth. No trace of geraniums remained, but she spotted a gardener's shed in the corner, its door ajar. Filing the detail away, she rang the bell. Susan answered, her face ashen, her hands trembling as she took Miss Marple's coat. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank you for coming," she whispered. "Mrs. Pritchard's in the drawing-room, but she's so weak. The doctor's been and gone, and Nurse Coupling's with her. It's been awful." Miss Marple patted her arm. "You're doing your best, my dear. Tell me, where was the tray when you found the petal?" Susan hesitated, glancing toward the hall. "In the kitchen, miss. I'd just set it out. Tea, toast, and a boiled egg, like always. I turned away to fetch the marmalade, and when I looked back, there it was, right on the plate. I swear it wasn't there before." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "And who else was in the kitchen?" "Only George, miss, polishing the silver. He looked as shocked as I was when I screamed." Susan's voice quavered. "I don't understand how it got there." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The kitchen, a busy hub of the household, offered ample opportunity for mischief. She followed Susan to the drawing-room, where the air was heavy with the scent of lavender and something sharper, like disinfectant. Mrs. Pritchard lay on a chaise longue, a blanket tucked around her, her face pale as parchment. Nurse Coupling stood nearby, adjusting a tray of vials with practised efficiency, her expression one of studied concern. "Miss Marple, how kind," Mrs. Pritchard said, her voice a thread. "You've heard, I suppose? The petal, it was there, on my tray, just as she said." Her hands clutched the blanket, and her eyes, wide with terror, darted to the windows, as if expecting flowers to bloom from the glass. "I heard, Mrs. Pritchard," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "It must have been a shock. But these things often have simple explanations. A prank, perhaps, or a mistake." Her tone was soothing, but her gaze lingered on Nurse Coupling, who met it with a tight smile. "A prank?" Nurse Coupling said, her voice crisp. "I doubt it. Mrs. Pritchard's nerves are fragile, and this sort of thing could kill her. I've told Dr. Sims we need to keep visitors to a minimum." She glanced at Miss Marple, the rebuke clear. Miss Marple's smile remained serene. "Of course, nurse. You're quite right to be cautious. But a friendly face can do wonders, don't you think?" She turned to Mrs. Pritchard. "Tell me, my dear, how are you feeling now?" Mrs. Pritchard's lips trembled. "Weak, Miss Marple, and so ill. My stomach's been wretched all day, and my head, oh, it's like a fog. I keep thinking of those geraniums growing closer." She shuddered, and Nurse Copling handed her a glass of cloudy liquid, urging her to drink. Miss Marple watched closely, noting the faint grimace as Mrs. Pritchard sipped the tonic. The smell, sharp and chemical, reached her nose, and she made a mental note to consult Dr. Haydock about medicinal odours. "You're in good hands," she said, her voice warm. "Nurse Copling seems most capable." Nurse Copling inclined her head, but her eyes were wary. "It's my duty," she said. "Mrs. Pritchard's health is my priority. This petal nonsense has set her back weeks." She moved to tidy the tray, her movements precise, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of tension in her fingers. Susan, hovering by the door, spoke up hesitantly. "Miss Marple, would you like some tea? I can fetch it from the kitchen." Her voice was eager, as if desperate for a task. "That would be lovely, Susan," Miss Marple said, seizing the chance to explore further. "I'll come with you if I may. I'd love to see your kitchen. It's the heart of a house, don't you think?" Susan looked startled but nodded, leading the way. The kitchen was a spacious room, its copper pans gleaming on the walls, a fire crackling in the range. George was absent, but a young maid, polishing a teapot, glanced up nervously. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, noting the open window, the tray of breakfast dishes on the counter, and a small basket of herbs by the sink. The air held a faint chemical tang, not unlike the drawing-room, and she paused by the tray, examining it discreetly. "This is where you found the petal?" she asked, her tone casual. Susan nodded, pointing to a plate. "Right there, miss. I'd just set the tray down, and it appeared. I don't know how. I'd swear the plate was clean." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the counter, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. A small jar of dried leaves caught her attention, tucked behind a canister of flour. "These herbs," she said, "are they for Mrs. Pritchard's meals?" Susan shook her head. "Nurse Copling keeps those. She says they're for her tonics, but I don't touch them. She's very particular." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Dr. Haydock's warnings about herbal concoctions. Some plants, he'd said, could mask poisons, their bitterness, disguised by stronger flavours. She made a note to inquire about Nurse Copling's training, for her control over Mrs. Pritchard's diet was absolute. As Susan prepared the tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the household. "George seemed upset earlier," she said. "Is he often in the kitchen?" Susan hesitated. "He's been odd lately, miss. Distracted, like he's got something on his mind. He was here this morning, but he left right after I found the petal. Said he had to check the coal delivery." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. George's absence at such a moment was curious, and his rumoured debts, mentioned at the vicarage, suggested motives she could not yet dismiss. "And Mr. Hugh?" she asked. "Has he been to visit?" Susan's face clouded. "He was here last night, miss. He and Mrs. Pritchard argued about money, I think. He left in a huff, slamming the door. Nurse Copling said it upset Mrs. Pritchard terribly." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her thoughts were sharp. Hugh's ambitions, Susan's fear, George's distraction, and Nurse Copling's vigilance formed a complex web, and the petal was a deliberate knot in its centre. She sipped her tea, thanking Susan, and returned to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Pritchard had dozed off, her breathing shallow. Nurse Coupling, rearranging the vials, looked up as Miss Marple entered. "She's resting at last," she said, her voice low. "This morning's shock was too much. I hope you'll excuse us, Miss Marple. Mrs. Pritchard needs quiet." "Of course," Miss Marple said, rising. "I'll call again when she's stronger. Do take care of her, nurse." Her tone was kind, but her eyes held a glint that Nurse Coupling, had she noticed, might have found unsettling. As she left Rose Cottage, Miss Marple paused by the gardener's shed, peering inside. A sack of potting soil, a trowel, and a pair of gloves lay on a bench, but no flowers, living or dead. The absence of geraniums was telling, and she wondered where the petal had come from. A florist, perhaps, or a greenhouse. She made a note to ask Mrs. Bantry, whose gardener was a font of horticultural gossip. The village was alight with the news of Mrs. Pritchard's collapse, and Miss Marple, stopping at the post office, overheard Miss Weatherby's shrill voice. "It's a curse, I tell you. Madame Zelma's never wrong. That petal was a warning." The postmistress nodded, and Miss Marple, collecting her letters, smiled faintly. Superstition was a fog, obscuring the truth, and she intended to clear it. Back at her cottage she sat, by the fire, her knitting untouched. Clara, bringing in a tray of scones, chattered about Madame Zelma's latest prediction. A storm before the fete. Miss Marple listened, nodding, but her thoughts were with the petal. Its appearance was no accident, and its effect on Mrs. Pritchard was calculated. She recalled a case Sir Henry Clithering had shared, of a murderer who used staged omens to terrify their victim into illness. The mind, he'd said, can be as deadly as poison. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Poison, she thought, was a possibility she could not ignore. Mrs. Pritchard's symptoms, nausea, weakness, dizziness, were vague but consistent with slow poisoning, and Nurse Coupling's tonics, with their bitter taste and chemical smell, were a thread she must follow. She resolved to speak with Dr. Haydock, whose knowledge of toxicology was unmatched, and to watch Rose Cottage closely, for the first incident, she suspected, was only the beginning. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple picked up her needles, the rhythm soothing, but her mind was a whirl of patterns. The household at Rose Cottage was a stage, and someone was directing a deadly play. She would unravel it, stitch by stitch, before the curtain fell. Chapter 5. The Nurse's Domain. The first week of November draped St. Mary Mead in a chill fog, muting the village's colours and lending an air of secrecy to its lanes. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp, sat in her parlour with a pot of Earl Grey, her knitting a soft heap in her lap. Her thoughts, however, were far from the scarf she was crafting for the church bazaar. The incident of the blue geranium petal on Mrs. Pritchard's breakfast tray had sent ripples through the village, and Miss Marple, with her quiet knack for sifting truth from rumour, was piecing together the undercurrents at Rose Cottage. Sheer fortune-teller's prophecy, now a village obsession, was a smoke-screen, she suspected, for something far more tangible and sinister. Clara, bustling in with a plate of shortbread, brought fresh tidings. "Miss, they're saying Mrs. Pritchard's taken to her bed," she said, her voice hushed. "Dr. Sims was at Rose Cottage again yesterday, and Nurse Coupling's got the run of the place. My cousin at the chemist's says she's been ordering All sorts of medicines, strange ones too. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile remained mild. Strange medicines, Clara. That's interesting. Nurse Coupling strikes me as a very particular woman. She sipped her tea, recalling the sharp chemical smell in the drawing-room, and the cloudy tonic Mrs. Pritchard had drunk with such reluctance. I think I'll call on Rose Cottage today. I've a book on herbal remedies I promised to lend Nurse Coupling. It might cheer her patient. Clara's brows rose. You're brave, miss, going back there. The village says it's cursed, what? With those geraniums. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Curses, Clara, are often just clever stories. And stories, you know, have authors. She rose, selecting a worn volume from her shelf. A treatise on medicinal plants, dog-eared from her own studies. It was a pretext, but a useful one, for Miss Marple had learned that shared interests could loosen tongues, even those as guarded as Nurse Coupling's. The walk to Rose Cottage was brisk, the fog curling around the hedgerows like a living thing. The village high street was subdued, its shops half empty, though Miss Marple noted a small crowd near Madame Zelma's tent, where a sign promised revelations of fate. She paused, observing a young woman emerge, her face pale, clutching a scrap of paper. Superstition, Miss Marple thought, was a tide that lifted many boats and sank others. She continued on, her sensible shoes clicking on the path. Rose Cottage appeared through the mist, its Georgian facade sombre, its windows dim. The garden, stripped of its geraniums, looked desolate, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the gardener's shed, now locked, its padlock glinting faintly. She rang the bell, and Susan Blake answered, her thin frame swathed in a grey cardigan, her eyes red-rimmed as if from weeping. "Miss Marple?" Susan said, her voice trembling. "I'm so glad you've come. Mrs. Pritchard's upstairs. She's too weak to leave her room. Nurse Coupling's with her, but, oh, it's all so dreadful." She stepped aside, clutching the door as if for support. Miss Marple patted her hand. "You're bearing up well, my dear. I've brought a book for Nurse Coupling. Perhaps it will interest her. May I see Mrs. Pritchard?" Susan hesitated, glancing up the staircase. "Nurse Coupling's very strict about visitors, but I'll ask. She's in the sick-room now." She led Miss Marple to the hall, where a heavy silence hung, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock. The air carried a faint medicinal tang, sharper than before, and Miss Marple's nose twitched. Susan disappeared upstairs, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to examine the hall. A side table held a tray of used teacups, a crumpled napkin, and a small vial, its label smudged but legible, "Tincture of Belladonna." Her heart quickened. Belladonna, she knew from Dr. Haydock's lectures, was a potent drug, used in minute doses for heart conditions, but deadly in excess. She tucked the detail away, her face serene as Susan returned. "Nurse Coupling says you can come up, but only for a moment," Susan whispered. "Mrs. Pritchard's awake, but she's frail." The sick room was on the second floor, its door ajar, revealing a dim space heavy with the scent of camphor and lavender. Mrs. Pritchard lay in a four-poster bed, her face gaunt, her hands clutching the bedclothes. Nurse Coupling stood by a small table, mixing a powder into a glass of water, her movements precise. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her smile thin but polite. "Miss Marple, this is a surprise," Nurse Coupling said, her tone clipped. Mrs. Pritchard is resting, but you may sit with her briefly. She's had a trying week." Miss Marple nodded, settling into a chair by the bed. "I brought you this," she said, offering the book. "I thought you might find it useful, with your interest in remedies." Nurse Copling's eyes flickered with interest, though her expression remained guarded. "How thoughtful," she said, taking the book. "I've always studied herbs. My training in London included pharmacology. It's a pity more people don't understand their power." She set the book on the table, beside a locked cabinet that Miss Marple noted with interest. Mrs. Pritchard stirred, her voice a whisper. "Miss Marple, you're kind to come. I'm so tired, and the dreams, they won't stop. Those flowers," her eyes, clouded with fear, fixed on the window, where the fog pressed against the panes. Miss Marple took her hand, its thinness alarming. "Dreams pass, Mrs. Pritchard. You must focus on getting stronger. Nurse Copling is taking good care of you, I'm sure." Her tone was soothing, but her eyes darted to the glass of cloudy liquid on the bedside table, its smell sharp and familiar. Nurse Copling stepped forward, offering the glass. "Your tonic, Mrs. Pritchard. It'll help you sleep." Mrs. Pritchard grimaced but drank, her face twisting at the taste. Miss Marple watched, her mind racing. The tonic's bitterness, the chemical odour, and the vial of belladonna in the guh all formed a troubling pattern, one she could not yet fully trace. Hoping to draw Nurse Copling out, Miss Marple turned to her with a smile. "You must have seen many patients in your career, nurse. It's a demanding profession, but so rewarding." Nurse Copling's face softened slightly, though her eyes remained wary. "It is. I trained at St. Bartholomew's, you know, and worked in private homes after. Elderly patients mostly, with chronic conditions. It's a challenge, but I'm used to it." She paused, then added, "Mrs. Pritchard's case is delicate. Her heart, her nerves. She needs constant attention." Miss Marple nodded, her expression attentive. "You've had other patients like her, then? It must be hard, losing them, as one sometimes must." Nurse Copling's smile tightened. "It's part of the job. I've nursed several to their end. Natural causes, of course. Old age, mostly, or heart failure." She turned to adjust the pillows, her hands steady, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in her posture. The conversation was interrupted by Susan, who entered with a tray of broth, her hands trembling. "Nurse, I've brought Mrs. Pritchard's lunch," she said, setting it down. The broth smelled faintly of herbs, and Miss Marple's nose twitched, recalling the jar of dried leaves in the kitchen. "Thank you, Susan," Nurse Copling said, her tone sharp. "You can go now. I'll manage." Susan flinched, retreating quickly, and Miss Marple noted the girl's fear, a thread she would need to follow. Sensing her time was short, Miss Marple rose. "I mustn't tire you, Mrs. Pritchard," she said, patting her hand. "I'll call again soon. Nurse Copling, do let me know if the book proves useful." She smiled, but her eyes lingered on the locked cabinet, its key dangling from Nurse Copling's belt. Nurse Copling escorted her downstairs, her manner polite but firm. "Mrs. Pritchard needs rest, Miss Marple. I hope you understand." Her tone was a gentle dismissal, but Miss Marple's smile was unruffled. "Of course, nurse. You're doing splendid work." She stepped into the fog, her mind a whirl of impressions. The sick room, with its heavy air and locked cabinet, was Nurse Copling's domain, and her control over Mrs. Pritchard's care was absolute. The belladonna vial, the bitter tonic, and the nurse's guarded demeanour were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple suspected they fit together in a way that was far from innocent. As she walked home, she detoured past the chemist's where Mr. Hargreaves, a chatty man with a penchant for gossip, was sweeping the step. "Good day, Miss Marple," he called. "Heard about Mrs. Pritchard's collapse? The village is in a state." Miss Marple nodded, pausing. "It's distressing, Mr. Hargreaves. I understand Nurse Copling's been ordering medicines for her. Anything unusual?" Mr. Hargreaves leaned closer, his voice low. "Well, now you mention it, she's been asking for some odd things. Arsenic, for one, though it's for medicinal use, mind you, in tiny doses. And belladonna, digitalis, all for Mrs. Pritchard's heart, she says. I don't question a nurse's orders, but it's a lot for one patient." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. "You're very thorough, Mr. Hargreaves. It's a comfort to know Mrs. Pritchard's in such careful hands." She thanked him, and continued on, her thoughts dark. Arsenic, belladonna, digitalis, each a medicine in small doses, a poison in larger ones. She recalled Dr. Haydock's warning. The line between remedy and ruin is thin, and a clever hand can cross it unnoticed. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting idle. Clara, bringing in a tray of tea, chattered about the latest village talk. Madame Zelma had predicted a stranger's arrival, and Mrs. Bantry was convinced it was a new curate. Miss Marple listened, nodding, but her mind was with Nurse Copling. The nurse's training, her access to poisons, and her dominance over the household were a dangerous combination, and Mrs. Pritchard's symptoms, nausea, weakness, confusion, aligned, disturbingly, with slow poisoning. She thought of Sir Henry Clithering's tales of nurses who betrayed their trust, using their expertise to kill. "They're the perfect culprits," he'd said, "because no one suspects care." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Nurse Copling's care, she suspected, was a mask, and the geranium petal, a distraction. She resolved to watch the nurse closely, to probe Susan's fears, and to enlist Dr. Haydock's expertise. For the truth, she felt, was blooming just beneath the surface. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple picked up her needles, the rhythm soothing, but her mind was a tapestry of suspicion. Rose Cottage was a stage, and Nurse Copling its director, orchestrating a drama that could end in tragedy. Miss Marple would unravel it, thread by thread, before the final act. Chapter 6. A Village Stir. The fog that had cloaked St. Mary Mead for days gave way to a brittle November clarity, the kind that sharpened the outlines of the village's cottages and cast long shadows across its lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her black felt hat pinned firmly against the wind, stood at her garden gate, surveying the high street with eyes that missed nothing. The village was alight with anticipation, for the annual fete was imminent, and with it came a fresh wave of gossip about Rose Cottage and the prophecy of the blue geraniums. Mrs. Pritchard's collapse, sparked by the mysterious petal on her breakfast tray, had elevated Madame Zelma to near-mythic status, and Miss Marple, with her quiet instinct for human motives, sensed that the fortune-teller's influence was a thread in a far darker weave. Clara, her maid, had been a fountain of village talk, relaying snippets from the milkman and the seamstress. "Miss, they're saying Madame Zelma's predicted another sign for Mrs. Pritchard," Clara said that morning, polishing the silver with vigour. "Something about geraniums again, at the fete no less. The vicar's in a flap, says it's unchristian, but half the village is flocking to her tent." Clara's tone was equal parts awe and disapproval, but Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind quickened. "Another sign, Clara," she said, folding her knitting. "That's bold, even for a fortune-teller. I think I'll attend the fete myself. Mrs. Bantry's flower stall could use an extra hand, and I'd like to see this stir for myself." She rose, selecting a jar of her homemade rosehip jelly as a contribution to the Fates Preserves table. But her true purpose was to observe the village's pulse and, if possible, the players in the Rose Cottage drama. The fete was held on the village green, a patchwork of stalls and bunting under a sky of scudding clouds. The air was thick with the scents of mulled cider, fresh scones, and the faint mustiness of second-hand books. Miss Marple, stationed at Mrs. Bantry's flower stall, arranged dahlias and late roses with practised care, her fluffy shawl a beacon of respectability. Yet her eyes roamed, noting the crowd's mood, a blend of festive cheer and nervous excitement, as if the village awaited a revelation. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a tweed suit, was in her element, haggling over a pot of chrysanthemums. "Jane, you're a marvel," she said, thrusting a vase at a customer. "But have you heard? Madame Zelma's at it again. Swears there'll be another geranium sign for Mrs. Pritchard. The woman's shameless, profiting off poor Eleanor's nerves." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Shameless, perhaps, but clever," she said. "Fear is a powerful currency, Dolly, and Madame Zelma seems to know its value." She thought of her old friend Sir Henry Clithering, who had once described a swindler who used omens to manipulate their marks. "The trick," he'd said, "is to make the victim believe the threat is fate." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Madame Zelma's tent, its purple flaps drawn back to reveal a queue of villagers, their faces eager or anxious. The fete hummed along, with children darting through the crowd, and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, presiding over the tea-tent with harried efficiency. Miss Marple, handing a bouquet to a customer, spotted Susan Blake near the tombola stall, her pale face tense as she clutched a basket of raffle tickets. Susan's presence was a surprise, given Mrs. Pritchard's condition, and Miss Marple resolved to speak with her, sensing the girl's fear held clues to the household's secrets. Before she could approach, a murmur rippled through the crowd, drawing eyes to the churchyard gate. There, framed by the ancient yews, stood Nurse Copling, her starched cap gleaming, escorting a frail Mrs. Pritchard, who leaned heavily on a cane. The village fell silent, then erupted in whispers, for Mrs. Pritchard's appearance, gaunt, trembling, her eyes wide with dread, was a spectacle none had expected. Miss Marple's heart sank at the sight, but her mind sharpened, noting Nurse Copling's firm grip on her patient's arm and the way her eyes scanned the crowd, as if gauging its reaction. Mrs. Bantry leaned close. "Good heavens, Jane, she looks half dead. What's Nurse Copling thinking, dragging her out like this?" Miss Marple's voice was low. "I wonder, Dolly, if it's not deliberate. A chance to show the village her frailty, perhaps to reinforce the prophecy." She watched as Nurse Copling guided Mrs. Pritchard to a bench near the church, where Susan hurried to join them, her basket abandoned. The crowd parted, some offering sympathetic nods, others whispering of curses and geraniums. Miss Marple excused herself, weaving through the stalls to the churchyard. She approached with a smile, her jar of jelly in hand. "Mrs. Pritchard, how brave of you to come," she said, her tone warm. "And Susan, Nurse Copling, it's good to see you all. The fete is quite the event, isn't it?" Mrs. Pritchard managed a weak nod, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "I wanted to see the flowers," she whispered. "But I'm so afraid, Miss Marple. Madame Zelma said there'd be another sign, here, today." Her eyes darted to the church, its stone walls softened by ivy. Nurse Copling's smile was tight. "Mrs. Pritchard insisted on coming, though I advised against it. Her heart can't take excitement, but she's stubborn." Her tone was solicitous, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of calculation in her eyes, as if the outing served a purpose beyond Mrs. Pritchard's wishes. Susan, hovering behind, spoke up, her voice barely audible. "I thought it might cheer her, Miss Marple. She loves the church flowers." Her hands trembled, and Miss Marple noted the girl's pallor, as if she too dreaded the prophecy's fulfilment. Before Miss Marple could reply, a gasp rose from the crowd near the church door. A young girl, clutching a hymn book, pointed to a vase on the steps, its contents spilling into view. A cluster of blue geraniums, their petals vivid against the grey stone. The village froze, then surged forward, voices rising in a chorus of shock and fear. Mrs. Pritchard let out a cry, her cane clattering to the ground, and collapsed against Nurse Copling, who swiftly produced smelling salts, her movements calm but efficient. Miss Marple's heart raced, but her face remained composed. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the vase. The geraniums were fresh, their stems neatly cut, not the wilted relics of a forgotten garden. She glanced at the churchwarden, Mr. Tuttle, who was wringing his hands nearby. "Mr. Tuttle, where did these flowers come from?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Mr. Tuttle, flustered, shook his head. "I don't know, Miss Marple. They weren't there this morning when I opened the church. Someone must have left them. Anonymous, like a donation." His voice quavered, and Miss Marple noted his unease, wondering if it stemmed from guilt or confusion. Nurse Copling, supporting Mrs. Pritchard, snapped, "This is outrageous. Whoever did this should be ashamed. Terrifying a sick woman." She guided Mrs. Pritchard toward the church porch, where Susan fanned her with a programme, her face ashen. The crowd pressed closer, some offering help, others whispering of Madame Zelma's powers. Miss Marple lingered by the vase, her mind racing. Geraniums in November were no accident, and their placement at the church, where Mrs. Pritchard was sure to see them, was a deliberate act. She thought of Dr. Haydock's tales of staged clues, designed to manipulate emotions. "The clever ones," he'd said, "use what's already believed." Miss Marple's gaze swept the crowd, searching for familiar faces from Rose Cottage. George, the butler, was absent, but she spotted him later, near the cider stall, his face drawn, a glass in his hand. His presence at the fete, after his rumoured visit to Madame Zelma, was a thread she would need to pull. Returning to the flower stall, Miss Marple found Mrs. Bantry in a state of indignation. "Jane, it's a scandal. Those geraniums. Someone's playing a cruel trick, and I'll bet it's that fortune-teller stirring up trouble for profit." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Perhaps Dolly, But I wonder if Madame Zelma is the puppet, not the puppeteer. Someone is using her prophecy to great effect. She thought of Nurse Copling's control over Mrs. Pritchard's care, the locked cabinet in the sick room, and the chemical tang of the tonics. The geraniums, she suspected, were a distraction, masking a more insidious threat. As the fate wound down, Miss Marple slipped into the church, where the geraniums had been moved to a side table, their petals still vibrant. She examined them closely, noting their freshness and the absence of soil on their stems. A greenhouse, she thought, or a florist's shop. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's gardener, who supplied flowers for village events, and resolved to ask about local sources. The church was quiet, its pews empty, but Miss Marple's senses were alert, catching a faint rustle from the vestry. She paused, but no one emerged, and she filed the sound away, wondering if someone had lingered to watch the drama unfold. Outside, the crowd was dispersing, and Miss Marple rejoined Mrs. Bantry, who was packing up the stall. "Jane, you've got that look," Mrs. Bantry said, narrowing her eyes. "What's brewing in that mind of yours?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only questions, Dolly. The geraniums are a puzzle, and I'm fond of puzzles. They always have a solution if you look closely." She thought of her nephew Raymond's detective stories, where clues were often misdirection. The trick, he'd written, is to see what's hidden in plain sight. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. Clara, bringing in a tray of cocoa, chattered about the fate's aftermath. Madame Zelma's tent had been mobbed, and Nurse Copling had whisked Mrs. Pritchard home, declaring her unfit for visitors. Miss Marple listened, nodding, but her thoughts were with the geraniums. Their appearance was no coincidence, and their effect on Mrs. Pritchard, fear, collapse, dependence on Nurse Copling, was calculated. She recalled Sir Henry Clithering's account of a poisoner who used terror to weaken their victim, making death seem natural. "The body follows the mind," he'd said, "and a clever killer knows it." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Mrs. Pritchard's symptoms, nausea, weakness, confusion, were consistent with poisoning, and Nurse Copling's tonics, with their bitter taste and chemical smell, were a focal point. The geraniums, she suspected, were a tool to amplify fear, masking the true danger. She resolved to visit Dr. Haydock, whose expertise could confirm her suspicions, and to probe George's behaviour, for his distraction and rumoured debts suggested a man under pressure. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple picked up her needles, the rhythm soothing, but her mind was a tapestry of suspicion. Rose Cottage was a web, and someone was spinning it with deadly precision. She would unravel it, stitch by stitch, before the prophecy of the blue geraniums claimed its final victim. Chapter 7. The Nephew's Motive. The November days in St. Mary Mead grew shorter, the village settling into a rhythm of early dusk and crackling fires. Miss Jane Marple, her parlour aglow with lamplight, sat with her knitting, though her needles moved with less purpose than usual. The fate's shocking incident, the vase of blue geraniums at the church, followed by Mrs. Pritchard's collapse, had deepened the village's obsession with Madame Zelma's prophecy, and Miss Marple, with her quiet knack for untangling human motives, felt the threads of the Rose Cottage mystery tightening. The geraniums, she suspected, were a distraction, orchestrated to mask a more sinister intent, and her thoughts now turned to the absent figure of Hugh Pritchard, Mrs. Pritchard's nephew, whose shadow loomed large over the household. Clara, bringing in a tray of tea and biscuits, was brimming with village gossip. "Miss, you'll never guess," she said, setting the tray down with a clink. "Mr. Hughes, back in St. Mary Mead, roared in this morning in that fancy car of his. My cousin at the pub says he was there last night, drinking and talking big about some business deal. Everyone's saying he's after his aunt's money, what with her so poorly." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile remained gentle. "Hugh Pritchard, back so soon? That's interesting, Clara. A nephew's concern is natural, of course, but timing can be telling." She sipped her tea, recalling Susan's mention of Hugh's argument with Mrs. Pritchard the night before the petal incident. Money, she knew, was a motive as old as time, and Hugh's reputed debts suggested a man in need of quick solutions. "I think I'll call on Rose Cottage tomorrow," she said. "Mrs. Pritchard may appreciate a visitor, and I've a pattern. For a shawl I promised Susan." Clara's brows rose. "You're brave, miss, with all this talk of curses. They say Nurse Copling's got Mrs. Pritchard locked away like a prisoner." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Prisoners, Clara, often have keys hidden in plain sight. And I'm only an old woman with a fondness for patterns." Her mind, however, was far from idle, weaving together the clues of the past weeks. The chemical tang of Nurse Copling's tonics, Susan's fear, George's distraction, and now Hugh's return. She thought of her old friend Sir Henry Clithering, who had once described a case where a desperate heir used charm to mask greed. "The charming ones," he'd said, "are often the most dangerous." The next morning Miss Marple donned her best coat, a sober grey wool, and set out for Rose Cottage, the shawl pattern tucked in her bag. The village was quiet, its high street dusted with frost, though a small crowd lingered near Madame Zelma's tent, where a new sign promised "Visions of Truth." Miss Marple paused, noting a young man in a flashy overcoat emerge, his face flushed. "Hugh Pritchard," she thought, recognizing the description from Clara's gossip. His presence at the fortune-teller's tent was curious, and she filed it away, her steps quickening toward Rose Cottage. The house stood sombre under the bare trees, its windows reflecting the pale sky. The garden, stripped of its geraniums, was a patchwork of empty beds, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the gardener's shed, its padlock now rusted, suggesting disuse. She rang the bell, and Susan answered, her face drawn, her hands twisting, in her apron. "Miss Marple, thank goodness!" Susan whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Mrs. Pritchard's in the morning room, but Mr. Hughes with her, and— Oh, it's been tense. Nurse Copling's upstairs, but she'll be down soon." Her voice quavered, and Miss Marple patted her arm, sensing the girl's dread. "You're doing your best, my dear," Miss Marple said. "I've brought that shawl pattern. Perhaps we can look at it later. May I see Mrs. Pritchard?" Susan nodded, leading her to the morning room, where the air was warm but heavy with tension. Mrs. Pritchard sat by the fire, a shawl about her shoulders, her face ashen. Hugh Pritchard, a handsome man in his late 20s with slicked-back hair and a tailored suit, lounged in a chair, a glass of sherry in hand. His smile as he rose to greet Miss Marple was dazzling, but Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the strain in his jaw, the restless tap of his fingers. "Miss Marple, a pleasure," Hugh said, his voice smooth. "Aunt Eleanor's been telling me about your visits. You're the talk of the village with your jams and jellies. His charm was effortless, but Miss Marple noted the flicker of calculation in his eyes, as if weighing her influence. Mrs. Pritchard managed a weak smile. "Miss Marple's been so kind, Hugh, but I'm afraid I'm poor company today. My nerves, ever since the church." Her hands trembled, and she glanced at the windows, as if expecting geraniums to bloom from the sills. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her bag on her lap. "The fate was upsetting, Mrs. Pritchard, but you're stronger than you think. A little company does wonders. Don't you agree, Mr. Pritchard?" Her tone was gentle, but her gaze was fixed on Hugh, probing for a reaction. Hugh's smile tightened. "Oh, absolutely. That's why I'm here. Family duty, you know. Aunt Eleanor's been through too much with this fortune-teller nonsense." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I keep telling her to ignore that Zelma woman. It's all rot, isn't it?" Mrs. Pritchard's lips quivered. "You don't understand, Hugh. The geraniums, they're real. I saw them at the church, on my tray. They're coming for me." Her voice rose, and Hugh patted her hand, though his expression was one of barely concealed impatience. Miss Marple's mind raced. Hugh's dismissal of the prophecy was telling, especially given his visit to Madame Zelma's tent. Was he feigning disbelief, or was he unaware of the geranium's true purpose? She steered the conversation lightly. "You've been away, Mr. Pritchard. London, I presume. It must be a change, coming back to our quiet village." Hugh laughed, a touch too heartily. "London's my playground, Miss Marple. Business, you know, investments, opportunities. But I always come back for Aunt Eleanor." He turned to Mrs. Pritchard, his tone coaxing. "Speaking of which, Aunt, I was hoping we could talk about that loan we discussed. It's a sure thing this time. A property deal that'll set me up for life." Mrs. Pritchard's face clouded. "Hugh, I've told you I can't. Not now, with my health. And the estate's tied up until—" Her voice faltered, and she clutched her shawl, her eyes darting to Miss Marple as if seeking rescue. Hugh's smile vanished, his jaw clenching. "Aunt, you know I'd pay it back. You've got more than you need, and I'm family." His voice was low, but the edge was unmistakable, and Miss Marple noted Susan's flinch, the girl hovering by the door with a tray of tea. Before Miss Marple could intervene, the door opened, and Nurse Copling entered, her starched uniform crisp, her expression one of controlled disapproval. "Mrs. Pritchard, you're overtaxing yourself," she said, her eyes flicking to Hugh. "Mr. Pritchard, I must ask you to keep these visits short. Her heart can't take it." She moved to the sideboard, preparing a glass of cloudy tonic, its sharp smell filling the room. Hugh rose, his face flushed. "I'm not the one upsetting her, nurse. Maybe if you didn't fill her head with pills and potions, she'd be stronger." He stormed out, slamming the door, and Mrs. Pritchard let out a small cry, her hands trembling. Miss Marple's heart sank, but her mind was alert. Hugh's temper, his demand for money, and his visit to Madame Zelma suggested a man under pressure. But whether he was complicit in the geranium scheme, or merely opportunistic, she could not yet say. She turned to Nurse Copling, who was urging Mrs. Pritchard to drink the tonic. "You have a challenging role, nurse," she said, her tone sympathetic. "Managing family, as well as a patient, must be taxing." Nurse Copling's smile was thin. "It's my duty, Miss Marple. Mr. Pritchard's visits are disruptive, but I manage. Mrs. Pritchard needs stability." She handed the glass to her patient, who sipped it with a grimace, and Miss Marple noted the nurse's steady hands, the locked cabinet key at her waist. Susan, setting down the tea tray, spoke up hesitantly. "Miss Marple, would you like a cup? I made it fresh." Her voice was eager, as if desperate to please, and Miss Marple accepted, using the moment to draw her out. "Thank you, Susan," she said, sipping the tea. "You must find Mr. Pritchard's visits trying. He seems a lively young man." Susan's face paled. "He's not always kind, miss. Last night he and Mrs. Pritchard argued so loudly, I thought the house would shake. He wants money, but she's afraid to give it." She glanced at Nurse Coupling, who was adjusting Mrs. Pritchard's pillows, and lowered her voice. "Nurse says he's a bad influence." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the household dynamics. Hugh's greed, Nurse Coupling's control, Susan's fear and George's absence, where was the butler during this visit, formed a complex web. She thought of Dr. Haydock's warnings about poisons that mimicked heart failure, their symptoms exacerbated by stress. Mrs. Pritchard's frailty, she suspected, was no accident, and the geraniums were a tool to keep her mind fragile. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a photograph on the mantel. Mrs. Pritchard and her late husband standing in a garden lush with blue geraniums. "What a lovely picture," she said, her tone light. "Your husband loved his garden, didn't he?" Mrs. Pritchard's eyes filled with tears. "He did, Miss Marple. Those geraniums were his pride. Now they're my curse." She shuddered, and Nurse Coupling handed her another dose of tonic. Her expression unreadable, Miss Marple rose, promising to return. "Take care, Mrs. Pritchard," she said, her voice warm. "And Susan, do let me know if you'd like that shawl pattern." She smiled at Nurse Coupling, but her eyes held a glint that the nurse, had she noticed, might have found unsettling. Outside, Miss Marple paused by the garden gate, where she spotted George, the butler, emerging from the shed, his hands smudged with dirt. He started at the sight of her, muttering about checking the tools, and hurried inside. Miss Marple's lips pursed. George's behaviour, coupled with his rumoured debts and visit to Madame Zelma, suggested a man with secrets, and the shed, she thought, warranted closer inspection. The village was quiet as she walked home, though she detoured past the pub, where Hugh's sports car was parked, its chrome gleaming. Through the window, she saw him at the bar, laughing with a group of locals, his charm in full force. Miss Marple's mind flashed to her nephew Raymond's stories of charming rogues, whose smiles hid desperate schemes. "Greed," he'd written, "is a fire that burns through reason." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. Clara, bringing in a tray of scones, chattered about Hugh's antics at the pub. He'd bought rounds for all, boasting of a big deal. Miss Marple listened, nodding, but her thoughts were with Rose Cottage. Hugh's motive was clear, money, but his role in the geranium scheme was uncertain. Was he a pawn, exploiting his aunt's fear, or a player, orchestrating it with another? Nurse Coupling's tonics, with their chemical smell, remained her focus. For Mrs. Pritchard's symptoms, weakness, nausea, confusion, aligned with slow poisoning, and the nurse's control was absolute. Miss Marple resolved to consult Dr. Haydock, whose knowledge of toxicology could confirm her suspicions, and to probe George's activities, for his distraction suggested more than financial woes. She thought of Sir Henry Clithering's maxim, "Motives overlap, but the truth lies in their intersection." Hugh's greed, Nurse Copling's dominance, and the geranium's terror formed a deadly triangle, and Miss Marple would find its centre. As the fire crackled, she picked up her needles, the rhythm soothing, but her mind was a tapestry of suspicion. Rose Cottage was a stage, and someone was directing a fatal play. She would unravel it, stitch by stitch, before the curtain fell on Mrs. Pritchard's life. Chapter 8. The fatal night a storm rolled into St. Mary Mead on the evening of November 12th, its thunder rattling the windows of the village and sending gusts of rain lashing against the thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlour fire, her knitting a soft heap in her lap, listened to the tempest with a calm that belied the disquiet in her mind. The events at Rose Cottage had reached a critical juncture. Hugh Pritchard's return and his heated demands for money, coupled with the persistent terror of the blue geraniums, had tightened the web of suspicion around Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard's household. Miss Marple, with her quiet genius for discerning human motives, felt the threads of this mystery converging, and she sensed that the storm outside was a harbinger of darker events within. Clara, her maid, bustled in with a tray of cocoa, her face flushed from the wind that had nearly snatched her cap on her way back from the grocer's. "Miss, it's a fearful night," she said, setting the tray down. "They're saying at the shop that Mrs. Pritchard's taken a turn, worse than before. Susan was there buying candles, and she looked like a ghost. Said the storm's got her mistress in a panic about those geraniums again." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile remained gentle. "A turn, Clara? That's troubling. Did Susan say anything else?" She sipped her cocoa, her thoughts racing back to the morning room at Rose Cottage, where Hugh's argument and Nurse Copling's tonics had left an indelible impression. Clara nodded, settling into a chair. "Only that Mr. Hugh left this afternoon, after another row with his aunt. Susan said he was shouting about money, and Mrs. Pritchard was crying when he drove off. Nurse Copling's been giving her extra doses of something to calm her, but Susan's worried it's doing more harm than good." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Extra doses in a household where the air carried a chemical tang, and Mrs. Pritchard's symptoms, nausea, weakness, confusion, suggested poisoning, were a red flag. She recalled her visit to Dr. Haydock the previous day, where she discreetly inquired about slow-acting poisons. "Arsenic," he'd said, "or digitalis in small amounts can mimic heart failure, especially in someone already frail. The symptoms build gradually, and a clever hand can pass it off as natural." Miss Marple had nodded, her suspicions about Nurse Copling's tonics deepening, and now Clara's news added urgency to her resolve. "I think, Clara," she said, setting her cup down, "I'll write a note to Susan, asking after Mrs. Pritchard. If the storm permits, I may call tomorrow. A friend's concern can be a comfort in such times." She rose, fetching her writing desk, but her mind was already at Rose Cottage, piecing together the roles of its players. Hugh's greed, Susan's fear, George's secrecy, and Nurse Copling's control. The storm raged on, its lightning illuminating the village in stark flashes, and Miss Marple, penning her note, felt a chill that had little to do with the weather. She thought of her old friend Sir Henry Clithering, who had once described a case where a storm had masked a murder. The chaos, providing cover for the killer's final act. Nature, he'd said, is a convenient ally for those with dark intent. Miss Marple sealed her note, resolving to watch Rose Cottage closely, for the night, she feared, held peril. Her fears were confirmed the next morning, when Clara burst into the parlour, her face pale. "Miss, it's awful!" she cried. "Mrs. Pritchard's dead, found this morning in her bed, with a sprig of blue geraniums in her hand. The village is in an uproar, saying it's Madame Zelma's curse come true. Dr. Sims was called, but he says it's her heart, just as expected." Miss Marple's heart sank, but her mind sprang to life. "A sprig of geraniums, Clara! In her hand." She set her knitting aside, her voice calm, but her eyes blazing. "That's no curse, my dear. It's a message. Tell me everything you know." Clara, trembling, recounted the details gleaned from the milkman, who had it from the Rose Cottage. Maid. Susan had discovered Mrs. Pritchard at dawn, her body cold, her face peaceful, but for the geraniums clutched in her fingers. Nurse Copling had summoned Dr. Sims, who attributed the death to heart failure, exacerbated by the terror of the prophecy. The village, already primed by weeks of gossip, was ablaze with talk of Madame Zelma, whose tent was now mobbed with those seeking her visions. George, the butler, had been seen weeping in the garden, while Hugh, summoned from London, was expected by noon. Miss Marple listened, her mind racing. The geraniums, fresh and deliberate, were no accident, and their placement in Mrs. Pritchard's hand suggested a calculated act, not a supernatural one. She recalled Dr. Haydock's words. "Poison can be timed, the final dose delivered when suspicion is least." She rose, donning her coat. "I must go to Rose Cottage, Clara. Susan will need support, and I want to see the scene for myself. Fetch my umbrella. It's a grim day for grim work." The walk to Rose Cottage was sombre, the village hushed under a sky of leaden clouds. The high street was deserted, save for a few villagers whispering outside the post office, their eyes following Miss Marple with a mix of pity and curiosity. She passed Madame Zelma's tent, now closed, its sign swaying in the wind, and noted the absence of the fortune-teller, wondering if she too was shaken by the tragedy, or complicit in its staging. Rose Cottage loomed ahead, its windows darkened, its garden sodden from the storm. The front door was ajar, and Susan answered Miss Marple's knock, her face streaked with tears. "Oh, Miss Marple," she sobbed, clutching a handkerchief. "She's gone. It's too horrible. I found her with those flowers. I can't bear it." Miss Marple took her hands, her voice steady. "You've been brave, Susan. Tell me what happened from the beginning. Every detail matters." She led the girl to the hall, where a fire burned low, the air heavy with grief and the faint familiar tang of chemicals. Susan, trembling, recounted the night. The storm had kept the household awake, with Mrs. Pritchard restless, calling out about geraniums. Nurse Copling had given her a sedative, insisting she sleep, and Susan had retired to her room, though she'd heard footsteps in the corridor around midnight. At dawn, she'd brought Mrs. Pritchard's tea, only to find her dead, the geraniums in her hand. "I don't know where they came from, miss," Susan whispered. "The garden's bare, and no one brought flowers in." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Footsteps at midnight, a sedative, and fresh geraniums suggested a deliberate act, timed to exploit the storm's chaos. She patted Susan's arm. "You've done well to tell me, my dear. Where's Nurse Copling now?" "In the sick room, with Dr. Sims," Susan said. "They're waiting for the coroner. Mr. Hugh's on his way, and George is in the kitchen beside himself." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the sick room. "May I see Mrs. Pritchard? I'd like to pay my respects if it's not too much trouble." Susan hesitated, then led her upstairs, her steps heavy with dread. The sick room was dim, its curtains drawn, the air thick with camphor and sorrow. Mrs. Pritchard lay in her bed, her face serene, her hands folded over the bedclothes, the geraniums removed, but their imprint visible in the creased sheet. Nurse Copling stood by the window, her face composed, though her eyes were wary, as Miss Marple entered. Dr. Sims, a portly man with a tired expression, was packing his bag, muttering about paperwork. "Miss Marple," Nurse Copling said, her tone cool. "This is a sad day. Mrs. Pritchard's heart gave out as I feared. The geraniums were the final straw. She was terrified." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "A tragedy, nurse. Those flowers, such a strange detail. Do we know where they came from?" Her eyes swept the room, noting the locked cabinet, now open, its contents neatly arranged, and a glass of cloudy residue on the bedside table. Dr. Sims shook his head. "No idea, Miss Marple. Probably some cruel prank, though it's done its damage. Her heart was weak, and the fear was too much. I've signed the certificate, natural causes." He glanced at Nurse Copling, who nodded, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained serene. Natural causes were convenient, especially when symptoms could be induced. She approached the bed, her eyes lingering on Mrs. Pritchard's hands, which bore faint green stains, as if she'd clutched the geraniums tightly. "She looks peaceful," she said, her tone soft, but her mind was with Dr. Haydock's warning. "Arsenic leaves traces, if you know where to look." As she turned to leave, Miss Marple's gaze fell on the bedside table where a small vase stood, empty but for a drop of water. "Did she keep flowers here?" she asked, her voice casual. Nurse Copling's eyes flickered. "No, Miss Marple. She hated flowers after the prophecy. That vase hasn't been used in weeks." Her tone was firm, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands, as if the question had struck a nerve. Downstairs, Miss Marple found George in the kitchen, his face haggard, a bottle of brandy open on the table. He started at her approach, muttering, "Miss Marple, it's a terrible thing. She was good to me always." His hands, she noticed, were clean, but bore faint scratches, as if from thorns or rough work. "You've served her well, George," Miss Marple said, her tone kind. "It must be hard, with all this talk of geraniums. Did you see anything unusual last night?" George shook his head, his eyes avoiding hers. "Nothing, miss. The storm kept me up, but I was in my room. I heard her cry out once, but Nurse Copling was with her." He took a swig of brandy, and Miss Marple noted his agitation, wondering if it stemmed from grief or guilt. As she prepared to leave, Hugh's sports car roared into the drive, its engine cutting through the silence. He strode in, his face pale but his manner brisk, shaking rain from his coat. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding. "Awful business, this. I came as soon as I heard. Where's Nurse Copling? I need to know what happened." "She's upstairs," Miss Marple said, her eyes studying him. His grief seemed genuine, but his quick arrival and the tension in his posture suggested more than familial duty. "It's a shock, Mr. Pritchard. Your aunt was much loved." Hugh's jaw tightened. She was. If that fortune-teller had kept her mouth shut, none of this would have happened. He stormed toward the stairs, and Miss Marple watched him go, her mind turning to his debts and his visit to Madame Zelma's tent. Was he a grieving nephew, or a man relieved of an obstacle? The village was in a frenzy as Miss Marple walked home, the news of Mrs. Pritchard's death spreading like wildfire. At the post office, Miss Weatherby was proclaiming the curse fulfilled, while the baker's wife whispered of Nurse Copling's negligence. Miss Marple listened, nodding, but her thoughts were with the geraniums. Their freshness, their placement, and their timing suggested a killer with access and intent, and Nurse Copling's tonics, with their chemical smell, remained her focus. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. Clara, bringing in a tray of scones, chattered about the coroner's inquest, set for tomorrow, where Dr. Sims's verdict was expected to stand. Miss Marple listened, but her mind was with the sick room, the vase, and the green stains on Mrs. Pritchard's hands. She recalled Sir Henry Clithering's maxim, "The final act is always the boldest, because the killer thinks they've won." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The fatal night had been staged, the geraniums a flourish to seal the prophecy's power. She resolved to attend the inquest, to probe George's scratches and Hugh's haste, and to enlist Dr. Haydick's help in testing her theory of poison. Rose Cottage was a chessboard, and someone had played a deadly gambit. She would checkmate them, move by move, before the truth was buried with Mrs. Pritchard. Chapter 9. Unravelling the Threads. The morning after Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard's death dawned cold and grey in St. Mary Mead, the village shrouded in a sombre hush that seemed to echo the storm's aftermath. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlour, with a pot of tea, gazed out at the frost-dusted garden, her knitting idle in her lap. The news of Mrs. Pritchard's passing, with a sprig of blue geraniums clutched in her hand, had sent the village into a frenzy of speculation, with Madame Zelma's prophecy now hailed as divine foresight. Yet Miss Marple, with her quiet genius for piercing the veils of human deceit, saw not a curse, but a carefully staged crime, its threads woven through the household at Rose Cottage. The coroner's inquest, set for that afternoon, loomed as a critical moment, and she was determined to unravel the truth before it was buried under a verdict of natural causes. Clara, her maid, entered with a tray of toast and marmalade, her face drawn with the weight of village gossip. "Miss, it's all anyone can talk about," she said, setting the tray down. "They're saying Mrs. Pritchard's death was fate, just like Madame Zelma predicted. But Susan was at the baker's this morning, and she's in a state, says she can't believe it's natural, not with those geraniums appearing from nowhere." Clara's voice trembled, but Miss Marple's remained steady, though her eyes gleamed with purpose. "Susan's instincts may be sharper than she knows, Clara," Miss Marple said, spreading marmalade with care. "Geraniums don't bloom in November, nor do they find their way into a sick room without help. I'll attend the inquest today. It's a chance to observe the household, and perhaps to ask a question or two." She sipped her tea, her mind racing back to the sick room. The empty vase, the green stains on Mrs. Pritchard's hands, and the sharp chemical tang of Nurse Copling's tonics. Her visit to Dr. Haydock had confirmed her suspicions. Arsenic, he'd said, could produce symptoms like Mrs. Pritchard's, its slow accumulation masking murder as illness. The trick, he'd added, is proving it before the body's buried. Miss Marple rose, selecting her soberest hat, a black felt with a modest brim, and a notebook for jotting observations. "I'll need you to run an errand, Clara," she said. "Take a note to Dr. Haydock, asking him to meet me after the inquest. His expertise will be crucial." She penned the note, her hand steady, but her thoughts were with Rose Cottage, where the players, Nurse Copling, Susan, George, and Hugh, each held a piece of the puzzle. She recalled Sir Henry Clithering's maxim, "The truth lies in the details, but you must catch them before they're swept away." The inquest was held in the village hall, a draughty space crowded with villagers, their faces a mix of curiosity and dread. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back, her fluffy shawl blending with the crowd. The coroner, a stern man from Much Benham, presided with brisk efficiency, calling witnesses in turn. Dr. Sims, the village doctor, testified first, his voice heavy with regret. "Mrs. Pritchard's heart was weak," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "The strain of her fears, those geraniums, the prophecy, proved too much. Death was by heart failure, natural causes." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others whispering of curses. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Dr. Sims's verdict was convenient, but it ignored the green stains, the fresh geraniums, and the footsteps Susan had heard at midnight. She jotted a note, her eyes fixed on Nurse Copling, who sat near the front, her starched cap gleaming, her face a mask of professional sorrow. When called, the nurse testified with calm precision, describing Mrs. Pritchard's declining health, her terror of the geraniums, and the sedative given to calm her during the storm. "I checked on her at 11, Nurse Copling said, her hands folded. "She was asleep, peaceful. I found her dead at dawn, with those dreadful flowers in her hand. I can't imagine where they came from." Miss Marple's pencil paused. The Shuju nurse's account was flawless, yet it omitted the locked cabinet, the cloudy tonics, and the chemical smell that had lingered in the sick room. She thought of Dr. Haydock's warning. A poisoner's strength is their routine. Every dose looks like care. Nurse Copling's testimony, she suspected, was a performance designed to deflect scrutiny. Susan was next, her voice barely audible, her hands trembling as she clutched a handkerchief. "I brought her tea at 6, she said, her eyes downcast. She was gone, with the geraniums in her hand. I heard footsteps in the night, but I thought it was Nurse Copling checking on her." Her voice broke, and the coroner, impatient, moved on, but Miss Marple noted Susan's fear, as if she sensed a truth she dared not voice. George, the butler, followed, his face haggard, his hands marked with fresh scratches that Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught at once. "I was in my room all night," he said, his voice gruff. "The storm kept me up, but I didn't see nothing. Mrs. Pritchard was good to me. I'd never harm her." His eyes darted to Nurse Copling, and Miss Marple wondered if his loyalty was to his mistress or to someone else in the household. Hugh Pritchard, the final witness, strode to the stand with a confidence that bordered on defiance. His tailored suit and polished shoes stood out in the drab hall, and his voice carried a note of indignation. "My aunt was terrorized by that fortune-teller," he said, his jaw tight. "I tried to tell her it was nonsense, but she was too frail. I was in London when she died, got the call at midnight and drove straight here. It's a tragedy, but it's no mystery. Her heart gave out." The crowd stirred, some nodding, others whispering about his debts, and Miss Marple's pencil flew, noting his alibi and the haste of his return. The coroner, after brief deliberation, returned a verdict of death by natural causes, citing heart failure exacerbated by psychological distress. The villagers filed out, their voices a chorus of relief and superstition. But Miss Marple remained seated, her mind a whirl of connections. The inquest had closed the case for most, but for her it had opened new avenues. The geraniums, the footsteps, the scratches on George's hands, and Nurse Copling's flawless testimony were threads she must weave together, and quickly. She found Susan outside the hall, shivering in the cold, her eyes red from crying. "Susan, my dear," Miss Marple said, drawing her aside, "you've been through so much. Tell me, those footsteps you heard, were they heavy, like a man's, or lighter?" Susan hesitated, glancing around. "Light, miss, like Nurse Copling's, but I can't be sure. It was so stormy. And there's something else." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I saw Nurse Copling mixing a powder into Mrs. Pritchard's cocoa the night before she died. I thought it was sugar, but it looked different, finer." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. "You're very observant, Susan. That's important. Did you tell anyone else?" Susan shook her head. "I was afraid, miss. Nurse Copling's so strict. And now Mrs. Pritchard's gone. I don't know what to think." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. The powder, the chemical smell, and Susan's fear pointed to Nurse Copling. But proof was elusive, and the geraniums suggested a broader scheme. Miss Marple's next stop was Dr. Haydock's surgery, where she found him in his cluttered office, surrounded by medical journals. "Jane, you look like a woman on a mission," he said, his eyes twinkling. "What's this about Mrs. Pritchard? Your note was cryptic." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her voice low. "I need your expertise, doctor. Mrs. Pritchard's symptoms, nausea, weakness, confusion, and heart trouble. Could they be arsenic poisoning, administered slowly? And could it be detected post-mortem?" Dr. Haydock's face grew grave. "Arsenic's a nasty one," he said, leaning back. "In small doses, it mimics natural ailments, especially in the elderly. Nausea, fatigue, heart palpitations. It's all there. A post-mortem could detect it if you look for it in the hair or nails, but you'd need a court order for exhumation, and Dr. Sims's verdict makes that unlikely." He paused, studying her. "You suspect someone, don't you? That nurse, perhaps?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I suspect patterns, doctor. Nurse Copling had access, opportunity, and a locked cabinet of medicines. Susan saw her mixing a powder, and the tonics smelled wrong. But the geraniums, fresh, deliberate, suggest a mind that thrives on theatrics. I need to know if arsenic was used, and I need to know soon." Dr. Haydock nodded. "I'll make discreet inquiries at the coroner's office, see if there's any chance for tests. But Jane, be careful. If you're right, you're dealing with Someone ruthless. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I'm only an old woman, Doctor, with a fondness for truth. But I'll take care. She rose, her mind turning to George's scratches and Hugh's alibi. The butler's agitation and the nephew's haste were threads she could not ignore, and she resolved to probe further, perhaps by visiting the gardener's shed where George had been seen. Back in the village, Miss Marple detoured past Rose Cottage, where a small crowd lingered, whispering of curses. The house was dark, its windows shuttered, but she spotted George in the garden, raking leaves with a distracted air. She approached, her voice warm. George, what a sad day! You must be devastated after so many years with Mrs. Pritchard. George started, his hands tightening on the rake. Aye, miss, it's a blow. She didn't deserve this, not with all that talk of geraniums. His eyes were red, and Miss Marple noted the fresh scratches on his hands, deeper than before, as if from recent work. Those geraniums, she said, her tone light, so strange, appearing in her hand. Did you ever see flowers brought into the house? George shook his head, his voice gruff. No, miss. The garden's bare, and Mrs. Pritchard hated flowers after that prophecy. I don't know where they came from. He turned back to his raking, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of fear in his eyes, as if he knew more than he said. As she walked home, Miss Marple's mind was a tapestry of clues. Susan's powder, George's scratches, Hugh's alibi and Nurse Copling's control. The geraniums were a flourish, designed to seal the prophecy's power. But the true weapon, she suspected, was poison, delivered with clinical precision. She thought of Sir Henry Clithering's case of a poisoner who used superstition to mask their crime. The victim's fear, he'd said, was their greatest ally. At her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. Clara, bringing in a tray of scones, chattered about the inquest's aftermath. Madame Zelma's tent was packed, and Hugh was at the pub, drowning his grief. Miss Marple listened, but her thoughts were with the sick room, the vase, and the powder in the cocoa. She resolved to speak with Susan again, to search the shed for traces of geraniums, and to press Dr. Haydock for results, for the truth, she felt, was within reach. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple picked up her needles, the rhythm soothing, but her mind was a whirl of suspicion. Rose Cottage was a chessboard, and someone had played a deadly move. She would checkmate them, stitch by stitch, before the truth was lost to the village's fear. Chapter 10. The Trap. The chill of mid-November settled over St. Mary Mead, frosting the village's hedgerows and lending a brittle edge to its quiet lanes. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her cosy parlour, sat by the fire with a pot of Darjeeling, her knitting a soft tangle in her lap. The coroner's verdict of natural causes in Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard's death had quelled the village's clamour, but Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human deceit, saw the blue geraniums not as a curse fulfilled, but as a murderer's flourish. Susan's whispered account of Nurse Copling mixing a powder into Mrs. Pritchard's cocoa, coupled with Dr. Haydock's confirmation that arsenic could mimic heart failure, had sharpened her suspicions. The inquest had closed the case for most. But for Miss Marple it was a call to action, and she resolved to set a trap to expose the killer before the truth was buried with Mrs. Pritchard. Clara, her maid, bustled in with a tray of scones, her eyes wide with the latest village talk. Miss, They're saying Mr. Hugh's staying at Rose Cottage, sorting his aunt's affairs," she said, setting the tray down. "He's all charm now, but my cousin at the pub says he's been asking about the will, and Susan, she's leaving for London, says she can't stay in that house another day." Clara's voice held a tremor, but Miss Marple's remained calm, though her mind raced. "Susan's leaving, Clara," Miss Marple said, spreading butter on a scone. "That's significant. A frightened bird flees the nest, but sometimes it carries secrets in its wings. I think I'll invite the Rose Cottage household to tea tomorrow. Susan, Nurse Copling, George, and Mr. Hugh. A little gathering might shed light on things." She sipped her tea, her thoughts turning to the gardener's shed, where George's scratches and furtive behaviour suggested hidden clues. "And Clara, do ask your cousin if he's seen George near Madame Zelma's tent lately. His debts may be more than financial." Clara nodded, her cap bobbing. "You're up to something, miss. I can tell. Be careful. That Nurse Copling's got eyes like a hawk." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Hawks, Clara, can be outwitted by a sparrow if the sparrow knows the terrain. I'm only an old woman with a fondness for tea and truth." Her mind, however, was a whirl of strategy, recalling Sir Henry Clithering's tale of a trap that flushed a killer by exploiting their fear of exposure. "The guilty," he'd said, "always watch for the net, and in watching they betray themselves." Miss Marple resolved to weave that net, using the village's gossip and her own observations to provoke a reaction. She penned invitations to Rose Cottage's residents, her handwriting neat, but her words carefully chosen. Id, small tea to honour Mrs. Pritchard's memory, and to share a discovery I've made about her final days. The word discovery was deliberate, a bait to unsettle the guilty, and she sent Clara to deliver the notes, knowing the village's grapevine would amplify their impact. Her next task was to visit Dr. Haydock, whose inquiries at the coroner's office had yielded a slim hope. A post-mortem test for arsenic was possible, but only with new evidence to justify exhumation. Miss Marple needed that evidence, and her tea party, she hoped, would provide it. The following afternoon, Miss Marple's cottage was a picture of warmth, its parlour adorned with chrysanthemums and a table set with her best china. The fire crackled, casting a glow over the sandwiches, scones, and a Victoria sponge Clara had baked with pride. Miss Marple, in her black silk dress, moved with the serene grace of a hostess, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing as her guests arrived. Susan was first, her face pale, her hands clutching a worn valise as if ready to flee. "Miss Marple, you're so kind," she said, her voice quavering. "But I'm leaving tomorrow. I can't stay in St. Mary Mead. It's too much after everything." Her eyes darted to the door, and Miss Marple noted her fear, suspecting it stemmed from more than grief. George followed, his butler's formality frayed, his hands still bearing faint scratches that Miss Marple's keen gaze caught at once. "Miss," he said, bowing stiffly, "it's good of you to remember Mrs. Pritchard. She'd have liked this." His voice was gruff, but his eyes avoided hers, and Miss Marple wondered if his loyalty to Rose Cottage hid a deeper secret. Nurse Copling arrived next, her starched uniform replaced by a severe grey dress, her smile as thin as ever. "Miss Marple, a thoughtful gesture," she said, her tone clipped. though I hope this won't stir more village gossip. Mrs. Pritchard's death was tragic enough. Her hands, folded in her lap, were steady, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of wariness in her eyes, as if she sensed a challenge. Hugh Pritchard was last, his tailored suit and easy charm at odds with the sombre occasion. "Miss Marple, you're a saint," he said, kissing her hand with a flourish. "Aunt Eleanor would have loved this. Tea and good company. Let's hope it puts all this cursed nonsense to rest." His smile was dazzling, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped his knee, suggesting a man on edge. Tea was poured, and Miss Marple steered the conversation to Mrs. Pritchard's life, her love of gardening, her kindness to her staff. The guests nodded, their responses polite but guarded, and Miss Marple watched them closely, noting Susan's trembling hands, George's downcast eyes, Nurse Copling's rigid posture, and Hugh's forced joviality. The air was thick with unspoken tensions, and she chose her moment with care. "I've been thinking about Mrs. Pritchard's final days," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear as she passed the scones. "It's curious, don't you think, how those geraniums appeared, fresh in November, when the garden was bare? I've made a discovery that might explain it, a clue found in the house that points to how they got there." She paused, setting a small vial on the table, its label blank, but its presence deliberate. "This was in the sick room, hidden away. It's not medicine, I'm told, but something else, something that might interest the police." The room stilled, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Susan gasped, her teacup rattling, while George's face paled, his hands clenching. Hugh's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing, but Nurse Copling's reaction was the most telling. Her fingers tightened on her cup, her knuckles white, though her face remained impassive. "A clue, Miss Marple?" she said, her voice steady. "That's quite a claim. What do you think it means?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression was grave. "I'm not sure, nurse, but it's troubling. The geraniums, the powder Susan saw you mix into the cocoa, the footsteps in the night. They suggest someone wanted Mrs. Pritchard's fear to end in death. I've asked Dr. Haydock to look into it, and he's speaking to the coroner about tests. The vial, in truth, contained only saline, a prop borrowed from Dr. Haydock, but its effect was immediate." Susan's eyes widened, her voice a whisper. "I didn't mean to say anything, miss, but it's true, I saw the powder. I thought it was nothing, but—" She trailed off, glancing at Nurse Copling, who shot her a look that could have frozen the fire. George shifted, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know nothing about powders, miss. I was in my room, like I said, but those geraniums, I saw none in the house, I swear." His scratches, Miss Marple noted, seemed fresher, as if he'd been handling something rough, perhaps in the shed. Hugh leaned forward, his charm replaced by urgency. "This is nonsense, Miss Marple. Aunt Eleanor died of her heart. Dr. Sims said so. You're stirring up trouble with this vial. What's in it, anyway?" His eyes flicked to the vial, and Miss Marple caught a glint of fear, as if he suspected its contents. Nurse Copling rose, her movements deliberate. "Miss Marple, I'm afraid you're mistaken. I mixed no powders but those prescribed. Sugar, for her cocoa, as Susan knows. This vial is news to me, and I'd caution against slander. I have a headache. I must excuse myself." She moved toward the door, her composure intact, but Miss Marple's trap had done its work. The nurse's haste betrayed her. Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Of course, nurse. Do rest. I'll keep the vials safe for Dr. Haydock. And I've heard a rumour, perhaps you've heard it too, of a witness who saw someone placing geraniums in the church before the fete. It's curious how such things come to light. The witness was fictional, another bait, but its effect was electric." George flinched, Hugh's face darkened, and Susan's hands shook, though Nurse Copling's departure was swift, her footsteps echoing in the hall. The tea party ended soon, after, with Hugh muttering about business in London, George retreating to his duties, and Susan lingering, her eyes pleading. "Miss Marple, I'm so afraid," she whispered. "What if it's true? What if someone did something?" Miss Marple patted her hand, promising to visit before she left for London, but her mind was with Nurse Copling, whose reaction had been the most revealing. That evening Clara returned with news. Her cousin had seen Nurse Copling burning papers in her room at Rose Cottage, a hurried act witnessed through a window. Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Burning papers, Clara, that's telling. A guilty conscience often seeks to erase its tracks." She thought of Dr. Haydock's case of a nurse who destroyed evidence when cornered, and resolved to act quickly before Nurse Copling could cover her trail further. She telephoned Dr. Haydock, arranging to meet him the next morning, and penned a note to Inspector Craddock, a practical man she'd met through Sir Henry, outlining her suspicions and requesting a search of Rose Cottage. The vial, the powder, the geraniums, and Nurse Copling's haste were enough to warrant investigation, and Miss Marple knew the inspector trusted her instincts. She sat by the fire, her knitting untouched, her mind a tapestry of clues. George's scratches, Hugh's alibi, Susan's fear, and Nurse Copling's control. The trap had shaken the web, and now she must watch where the spider fled. Clara, bringing in a tray of cocoa, chattered about the village's mood. Madame Zelma's tent was packed, and Hugh was at the pub, boasting of his inheritance. Miss Marple listened, but her thoughts were with the shed, where she suspected George had handled the geraniums, and the sick room, where the vial of saline had sparked Nurse Copling's flight. She recalled Sir Henry's maxim, "The guilty run when no one pursues, but the wise hunter follows." Miss Marple would follow, stitch by stitch, until the truth was laid bare. As the fire crackled, she picked up her needles, the rhythm soothing, but her mind was a whirl of strategy. Rose Cottage was a chessboard, and she had moved her queen. The next move, she knew, would be the killer's, and she would be ready. Chapter 11. The Confession. The grey dawn of November 14th broke over St. Mary Mead with a quiet that seemed to hold its breath, as if the village sensed the unravelling of its darkest mystery. Miss Jane Marple, rising early in her cottage, stood by the window, watching the frost glitter on the garden path. Her tea party the previous day had been a calculated gambit, the vial of saline and the fictional witness a net to snare the guilty. And Nurse Copling's abrupt departure had confirmed her suspicions. The news of the nurse burning papers, relayed by Clara's cousin, was a spark in a tinderbox, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human frailty, knew the time for action had come. The truth behind Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard's death masked by the blue geraniums, and Madame Zelma's prophecy lay within reach, and she would seize it before it slipped away. Clara entered the parlour with a tray of porridge and tea, her face alight with fresh gossip. "Miss, you won't believe it," she said, setting the tray down. "The village is buzzing. Inspector Craddock's at Rose Cottage this morning, with constables and all. They say he's searching the place, and Nurse Copling's been seen, pacing in the garden, looking like a trapped cat. My cousin says she tried to leave last night, but George stopped her, said she had to wait for the police." Clara's voice trembled with excitement, but Miss Marple's remained steady, though her eyes gleamed with purpose. "Inspector Craddock, Clara?" Miss Marple said, stirring her tea. "That's prompt. I hoped my note would stir him to action, but this is quicker than I expected, and Nurse Copling's agitation is telling. She's feeling the net tighten." She sipped her tea, her mind racing back to the tea party. Susan's trembling confession about the powder, George's scratched hands, Hugh's defensive bluster, and Nurse Copling's white-knuckled grip on her cup. The nurse's attempt to burn papers suggested a desperate bid to erase evidence, and Miss Marple resolved to join the inspector at Rose Cottage, under the guise of supporting Susan in her final days there. "I'll call on Rose Cottage after breakfast," she said. "Susan may need a friend, and I'd like to see what the inspector uncovers." Clara's brows rose. "You're bold, miss, walking into that hornet's nest. What if Nurse Copling's dangerous?" Miss Marple smiled, faintly. "Danger, Clara, often lies in stillness, not in noise, and I'm only an old woman with a concern for justice." Her mind, however, was a whirl of strategy, recalling Sir Henry Clithering's account of a killer cornered by their own panic. "The guilty," he'd said, "undo themselves when the pressure mounts. They can't help it." Miss Marple finished her porridge, donned her sober grey coat, and set out, her notebook tucked in her bag, ready to record the final pieces of the puzzle. The village was alive with whispers as she walked, the high street abuzz with villagers craning to see the police activity at Rose Cottage. Madame Zelma's tent, now deserted, sagged in the morning mist, its allure dimmed by the grim reality of Mrs. Pritchard's death. Miss Marple paused at the chemist's, where Mr. Hargreaves was sweeping the step, his face eager for news. "Miss Marple, have you heard?" he said, leaning close. "The police are after Nurse Copling's medicines. Say there's talk of poison. I told them about the arsenic and belladonna she ordered. All proper, mind you, but they're checking everything." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Hargreaves. It's a comfort to know the truth is being sought," she continued on, her thoughts with Dr. Haydock's warning about arsenic's insidious nature, its ability to mimic heart failure while leaving traces in the body. The chemist's confirmation of Nurse Copling's orders was a thread she'd woven into her note to Inspector Craddock, and now it was bearing fruit. Rose Cottage stood under a pall of mist, its windows glinting like wary eyes. 2 constables guarded the gate, their uniforms stark against the bare garden, and Miss Marple approached with her usual air of mild deference. "Good morning, officers," she said, her voice warm. "I'm here to see Miss Susan Blake. She's leaving for London, and I promised to help her pack. Inspector Craddock knows me, if you'd be so kind as to ask." Her fluffy shawl and gentle smile disarmed them, and one constable nodded, disappearing inside. Moments later, Inspector Craddock emerged, a tall man with a practical air and a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be here," he said, tipping his hat. "Your note was a bombshell. Arsenic powders, geraniums. We're searching the house now, and I'd value your thoughts if you've a moment after seeing Miss Blake." His tone was respectful, for he'd learned from Sir Henry to trust her instincts, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. "I'm happy to help, Inspector," she said. "Susan first, then I'm at your disposal. It's a sad business, but the truth must out." She followed him inside, where Susan waited in the hall, her valise packed, her face pale but resolute. The air was heavy with the scent of polish and the faint, persistent tang of chemicals, and Miss Marple noted a constable carrying a box of vials from the sick room, their labels glinting in the dim light. "Miss Marple, thank you," Susan said, her voice breaking. "I can't stay here. It's too much. The police are everywhere, and Nurse Copling. She's furious. Says it's all a mistake." Her hands trembled and Miss Marple took them, her touch steadying. "You're doing the right thing, my dear," Miss Marple said. "But before you go, tell me, did you see anything else that night? Anything about Nurse Copling or the geraniums? Even the smallest detail matters." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, probing for the final thread. Susan hesitated, glancing toward the stairs. "There was one thing, miss. After I heard the footsteps, I looked out my door, and I saw Nurse Copling coming from the sick room, holding something small, like a cloth or a bag. She went to her room, and I heard a lock click. I didn't think much of it then, but now—" Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A cloth or bag, locked away, could hold the geraniums or the poison itself, and Nurse Copling's nocturnal movements were damning. "You've been very brave, Susan," Miss Marple said. "Go to London, start fresh, and leave this to the inspector and me. You've helped more than you know." She patted Susan's hand, then turned to Craddock, who was conferring with a constable. "Inspector, may I see the sick room? I'd like to pay my respects to the space, if it's not too much trouble." Craddock raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Come along, Miss Marple. We've found something you'll want to see." He led her upstairs, where the sick room was a hive of activity. Constables cataloguing vials and papers. The locked cabinet, now open, revealed rows of bottles, some labelled arsenic and digitalis, others unmarked, and Miss Marple's heart quickened at the sight of a small cloth bag, its contents spilled on the table. Dried geranium petals, their blue faded but unmistakable. "Here's the prize," Craddock said, pointing to a vial of white powder, its label scratched off. "We're testing it, but it looks like arsenic hidden in the cabinet. And this," he held up a notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting, "details Mrs. Pritchard's symptoms day by day, with notes on doses. It's practically a confession, if it's what we think." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A notebook, Inspector? That's meticulous, even for a nurse. And the petals, where were they found?" She leaned closer, noting the bag's stitching, which matched a cloth she'd seen in Nurse Copling's room during an earlier visit. "In her personal effects," Craddock said. "She tried to burn some papers last night, but George caught her, and we recovered fragments. They mentioned doses and geraniums, enough to raise questions. She's in the morning room now, waiting for questioning. Care to join us?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind a tapestry of clues. Susan's footsteps, the burned papers, the notebook, and the petals. Nurse Copling's domain was crumbling, and the trap had sprung. She followed Craddock to the morning room, where Nurse Copling sat, her face pale but defiant, her hands folded tightly in her lap. George stood by the door, his face haggard, while Hugh paced, his charm replaced by nervous energy. "Miss Marple," Nurse Copling said, her voice icy, "I see you've brought the police into this. Your accusations are baseless. I've done nothing but care for Mrs. Pritchard." Her eyes darted to the vial in Craddock's hand, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of panic, the crack in her armour. Craddock set the vial and notebook on the table, his voice firm. "Nurse Copling, we've found arsenic in your cabinet, unmarked, and this notebook records doses that match Mrs. Pritchard's. Symptoms: the geranium petals hidden in your room suggest you staged the prophecy's signs. Care to explain?" Nurse Copling's composure wavered, her hands clenching. "It's a mistake," she said, her voice rising. "The arsenic was medicinal, prescribed by Dr. Sims. The notebook is my record of care. Every nurse keeps one. And the petals, I don't know how they got there. Someone's framing me." Her eyes flicked to George, then Hugh, but Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft but piercing. "Nurse Copling," she said, "you were seen mixing a powder into Mrs. Pritchard's cocoa, and Susan saw you with a cloth bag the night she died. The geraniums, fresh in November, came from somewhere, perhaps a greenhouse or a florist you visited discreetly. You used Madame Zelma's prophecy to terrify Mrs. Pritchard, weakening her mind while your poison weakened her body. Why? Was it the legacy she promised you, written into her will? The room stilled, the fire's crackle the only sound. Nurse Copling's face crumpled, her defiance giving way to despair. "You don't understand," she sobbed, her hands covering her face. "She was going to change her will, give it all to Hugh, that wastrel. I'd cared for her, years of it, and she promised me enough to retire. I only meant to make her ill, to keep her dependent, but the doses, they got out of hand. The geraniums were to make it look like fate, not murder." Her voice broke, and she slumped, the confession spilling like a dam burst. Craddock nodded, signalling a constable to take her into custody. "You'll come with us, Nurse Copling," he said, his voice grim. "There'll be a trial, and the evidence is clear." He turned to Miss Marple, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. That tea party was a masterstroke." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I only asked questions, Inspector. The guilty answer themselves if you listen." She glanced at George, whose relief was palpable, and Hugh, whose face was a mask of shock, though Miss Marple suspected his grief was tempered by the prospect of inheritance. Susan, standing in the hall, wept quietly, and Miss Marple moved to comfort her, her touch gentle. The police continued their search, but the confession was the keystone, and Miss Marple's work was done. She walked home through the village, where the news of Nurse Copling's arrest was already spreading, supplanting the talk of curses. Madame Zelma, questioned separately, denied any role, insisting her visions were genuine, and Miss Marple, recalling her fervour, believed her innocence, though her prophecy had been a perfect tool for the nurse's scheme. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. Clara, bringing in a tray of cocoa, chattered about the arrest. Nurse Copling was in Much Benham's cells, and Hugh was at Rose Cottage planning a memorial. Miss Marple listened, but her thoughts were with the sick room, the notebook, and the Geranium's deadly deceit. She recalled Sir Henry's maxim, "The truth is a quiet thing, but it cuts like a blade." Nurse Copling's confession had been that blade, severing the web of lies. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple picked up her needles, the rhythm soothing, but her mind was already turning to the village's next puzzle, for in St. Mary Mead, secrets never slept long. She had checkmated the killer stitch by stitch, and the board was clear for now. Chapter 12. The Quiet. After the pale sun of late November crept over St. Mary Mead, casting a tentative glow on the village's frost-kissed roofs and quiet lanes, Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlour by the bay window, watched a sparrow peck at crumbs on the sill, her knitting a soft heap of wool in her lap. The arrest of Nurse Copling for the murder of Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard had rippled through the village like a stone in a still pond, washing away the fever of Madame Zelma's prophecy and leaving a sober clarity in its wake. The blue geraniums, once a symbol of dread, were now understood as a killer's cruel prop, and Miss Marple, with her gentle genius for untangling human motives, felt the weight of resolution tempered by the melancholy of loss. Yet her mind, ever alert, lingered on the aftermath, for in St. Mary Mead the end of one story often sowed the seeds of another. Clara, her maid, bustled in with a tray of tea and crumpets, her face alight with the village's latest chatter. "Miss, it's like a new day out there," she said, setting the tray down with a clink. "Everyone's talking about Nurse Copling. Locked up in Much Benham, they say, awaiting trial. And Susan's gone to London, left yesterday with a new job lined up, thanks to Mrs. Bantry's cousin. But Mr. Hugh, he's still at Rose Cottage, strutting about like he owns it already." Clara's tone held a mix of awe and disapproval, but Miss Marple's remained calm, though her eyes gleamed with interest. "Susan's gone, Clara," Miss Marple said, spreading butter on a crumpet. "That's a wise move. A fresh start will do her good after such an ordeal. And Mr. Hugh's confidence is telling, though not surprising. A man with debts sees an inheritance as a lifeline." She sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to the morning room at Rose Cottage, where Hugh's charm had masked desperation, and George's scratched hands had hinted at unspoken burdens. The confession of Nurse Copling, provoked by Miss Marple's carefully laid trap, had closed the case, but loose threads remained. Threads she intended to tie before they unravelled anew. "I think I'll take a walk today," she said. "The churchyard is peaceful this time of year, and I'd like to see Mrs. Pritchard's resting place." Clara's brows rose. "The churchyard, miss? After all this? You're braver than me with those geraniums still in everyone's minds." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Geraniums, Clara, are only flowers, and fear is only a story we tell ourselves. I'm an old woman with a fondness for quiet places, nothing more." Her mind, however, was far from quiet, recalling Sir Henry Clithering's observation after a similar case. "The aftermath is where you see the truth of people. Grief reveals, but so does greed." She finished her tea, donned her warmest shawl, a soft lavender wool, and set out, her notebook tucked in her bag, ready to capture any final insights. The village was subdued, its high street dusted with frost, the shops half empty, as residents digested the shock of Nurse Copling's arrest. Madame Zelma's tent, once a beacon of mystique, had vanished overnight, the fortune-teller fleeing the village's scrutiny, and Miss Marple noted the empty patch of grass with a faint smile. Superstition, she thought, was a fragile thing when, faced with facts, and Nurse Copling's confession had stripped the prophecy of its power. She paused at the post office, where Miss Weatherby was regaling the postmistress with tales of the trial to come, her voice sharp with indignation. "Miss Marple, you must be pleased," Miss Weatherby called, spotting her. "You saw through that nurse's wickedness, poison of all things, and those geraniums, a devil's trick. The village owes you a debt, though I say we should have suspected her sooner, with her heirs and her locked cabinet." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You're kind, Miss Weatherby, but I only asked questions. The truth has a way of answering for itself." She moved on, her thoughts with the locked cabinet, where arsenic and geranium petals had hidden in plain sight, Nurse Copling's meticulous notebook, detailing doses and symptoms, had been her undoing, a testament to her hubris, and Miss Marple wondered if pride, as much as greed, had driven her to murder. The churchyard was a haven of silence, its yews casting long shadows over the graves. Mrs. Pritchard's plot, freshly marked with a simple stone, bore a wreath of white roses, their petals stark against the earth. Miss Marple paused, her hands clasped, her mind drifting to the woman who had lived in fear, her dreams haunted by flowers. "You're at peace now, Eleanor," she murmured, though her eyes scanned the ground, noting a scattering of faded petals near a nearby bench. Geraniums, their blue dulled by time. They were not fresh, likely remnants of the church fate's display, but their presence stirred her curiosity, for they lay where Mrs. Pritchard had often sat, praying in her final weeks. She settled on the bench, her notebook open, jotting observations, the petals, the wreath, the village's mood. Her thoughts turned to George, whose scratched hands and furtive visits to the gardener's shed had puzzled her. His grief at the inquest had seemed genuine, yet his debts, rumoured by Clara's cousin, suggested a man under pressure. Had he known of Nurse Copling's scheme, or been an unwitting pawn, perhaps tasked with procuring the geraniums? She resolved to speak with him, for his role, though minor, was a thread she could not leave dangling. Her reverie was interrupted by footsteps, and she looked up to see Mrs. Bantry, her tweed coat bright against the grey stones, approaching with a purposeful stride. "Jane, I thought I'd find you here," Mrs. Bantry said, settling beside her. "The village is singing your praises, you know, solving a murder right under our noses. But I'm worried about Hugh. He's at Rose Cottage, going through Eleanor's papers like a vulture, and I hear he's already talking to estate agents. It's unseemly, don't you think?" Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Unseemly, Dolly, but not unexpected. Hugh's debts are no secret, and an inheritance is a temptation few resist. I wonder, though, if he's found the will yet. Nurse Copling believed Mrs. Pritchard meant to favour her, which suggests a document worth killing for. She thought of Hugh's haste at the inquest, his polished alibi, and his visit to Madame Zelma's tent, wondering if his charm hid more than greed. Mrs. Bantry snorted. "If there's a will, he'll sniff it out. But Jane, what about George, my gardener? Says he's been asking for work. Says he's in debt to half the village. Could he have been mixed up in it?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "George is a puzzle, Dolly. His hands were scratched, as if he'd handled something rough. Perhaps geraniums, or something in that shed. He's loyal, but loyalty can be bought or coerced. I'll speak with him gently, to see what he knows." She closed her notebook, her mind turning to Dr. Haydock's post-mortem tests, which had confirmed arsenic in Mrs. Pritchard's remains, sealing Nurse Copling's fate. The shed, she thought, might hold the final clue to George's role, and she resolved to inspect it with Inspector Craddock's permission. The two women walked back to the village, their conversation turning to lighter matters. The Christmas, bazaar, the vicar's new sermon. But Miss Marple's thoughts remained with Rose Cottage. She parted from Mrs. Bantry at the High Street and made her way to the police station, where Inspector Craddock was reviewing reports, his desk cluttered with papers from the case. "Miss Marple, a pleasure," Craddock said, rising. "You've given us a tidy case. Nurse Copling's confession, the arsenic, the notebook. She's not talking now, but the evidence is ironclad. What brings you here? Not another mystery, I hope." His tone was teasing, but his eyes were keen, for he knew her visits were never idle. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not a new mystery, Inspector, but a loose end. George, the butler, his behaviour was odd, and his hands bore scratches, as if from handling plants. I wonder if he sourced the geraniums, perhaps under Nurse Copling's orders. Might I have your permission to check the gardener's shed at Rose Cottage? It's been nagging at me." Craddock raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "You've earned it, Miss Marple. I'll send a constable with you tomorrow morning. Can't have you poking about alone, not after this. And I'll have a word with George, see if he cracks." He paused, studying her. "You don't think he's guilty, do you?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not of murder, Inspector, but of complicity, perhaps. Fear and debt can make a man do strange things, and Nurse Copling was persuasive. She thanked him and left, her mind with the shed, where she suspected traces of geraniums or their source might linger. The next morning, Miss Marple arrived at Rose Cottage with a young constable, a lanky lad named Perkins, who carried a flashlight and a notebook. The house was quiet, its windows unshuttered, and Hugh's sports car was absent, suggesting he'd gone to London. George answered the door, his face drawn, his hands now free of scratches but marked by calluses, as if he'd been working hard. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice wary. "The inspector said you'd come. The shed's round back. I'll show you." The shed was a small weathered structure, its padlock removed, its interior cluttered with tools, sacks of soil, and a battered workbench. Miss Marple's eyes swept the space, noting a faint floral scent, not unlike geraniums, and a small crate tucked under the bench, its lid ajar. She gestured to Perkins, who opened it, revealing a bundle of dried geranium stems, their petals, faded but unmistakably blue. "Well, well," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, "not fresh, but recent enough. George, did you bring these here?" George's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't know, miss," he said, his voice hoarse. "Nurse Copling asked me to get geraniums, said it was for a remedy, something to calm Mrs. Pritchard. I got them from a mate at a greenhouse in Much Benham, dried them here. I didn't know she'd use them like that, I swear it." His eyes filled with tears, and Miss Marple patted his arm, her touch gentle but her mind alert. "You were misled, George," she said. "Nurse Copling used your loyalty, as she used Mrs. Pritchard's fear. Tell the inspector everything, it's the best way." Perkins jotted notes, and Miss Marple examined the crate, finding a receipt tucked among the stems, dated weeks before, the fate, confirming George's story. It was a minor thread, but it tied the geraniums to Nurse Copling's scheme, completing the pattern. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed, the scarf for the vicar's wife, growing steadily. Clara, bringing in a tray of cocoa, chattered about George's confession, now the talk of the village. He'd been questioned but released, his role deemed unwitting. Hugh, meanwhile, had found the will, which left him the bulk of the estate, and was planning a lavish memorial, though Mrs. Bantry called it a show. Miss Marple listened, nodding, but her thoughts were with Susan, now free in London, and George, whose honesty had spared him worse. She thought of Sir Henry Clithering's maxim, "The quiet after a crime is where you see the world reset. Some rise, some fall, but the truth endures." Nurse Copling's trial would come, and justice would be served, but Miss Marple's work was done. The geraniums, the powder, the notebook, and the shed had formed a deadly tapestry, and she had unravelled it stitch by stitch. Yet her mind, ever restless, turned to the village's pulse, sensing new stories waiting to bloom. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles clicked, the rhythm soothing, her scarf a testament to patience. St. Mary Mead was quiet, but not for long, and she would be ready, her eyes sharp, her heart steady, for the next puzzle to unfold.